It was a plot plucked straight from a modern teen drama.
They were the Three Musketeers, basically.
They had been friends for so long and starting to create this electric bond.
It's a love triangle kind of story, a bit of a one-sided triangle.
But when one of them disappears without a trace,
She says, I'm here because my boyfriend is missing.
the community comes together determined to find answers.
They suspect that something isn't right, but suspecting something isn't right is a long way from saying somebody is dead.
And when police dig deeper into the relationships,
It was kind of like, I want to be with you, and nothing else is going to matter.
they discover some tales are as old as time.
A deranged lover who was not going to accept rejection.
It's truly unhinged, obsessive, and bizarre.
This doesn't happen to normal people. It's very, soap opera-like.
Well, how do you think they come up with themes for soap operas?
After battling his demons finally won.
September 21st, 2012. With college football season in full swing, it's an exciting Friday morning in Gainesville, Florida.
Gainesville is a quaint little college town. It houses the largest university in the state, the University of Florida, home of the Fighting Gators.
No matter where you go in Gainesville, you're going to see orange and blue representing the University of Florida.
As students across campus head to morning classes, abuzz with weekend planning. One young woman, Rebecca Johnson, is instead heading into the university police office.
The University of Florida has their own police department. Just like a lot of major universities, they're responsible for the security and safety of all of the students and faculty.
Accompanied by her friend, Pedro Bravo, Rebecca tells the officers that she hasn't been able to get in touch with her boyfriend, Christian Aguilar, for almost 24 hours.
Rebecca told the police that she and Christian were supposed to hang out the night before, and this was a very unusual behavior for him to not have shown up for their date.
Pedro echoes Rebecca's concerns.
Pedro mentioned that he had hung out with Christian the day before, that he hadn't seen or heard from him since that particular time.
The desk officer assumed this was a circumstance where someone had essentially gone partying, as our students are prone to do.
But Rebecca and Pedro insist that this sort of behavior is out of character for Christian. He's a conscientious student who never misses class.
Chris wasn't out partying. Chris was studying, he had tests, he was busy. It was the middle of the fall semester.
She had something in her gut telling her that something was very, very wrong.
Miami native Christian Aguilar may have been shy, but he always opened up around the people he loved.
He was a very loving and caring person. When you were in front of Christian, you felt like you were the only thing in front of him.
By the time he started high school at Miami's prestigious Doral Academy, Christian began to blossom among his peers.
He always gave us satisfaction of being always in advanced classes and doing everything that he was supposed to do.
Even with all his studying, Christian found time to have a full social calendar.
This young man had two good friends that he had known throughout high school. One was Rebecca, and the other one was Pedro. Pedro and Rebecca were boyfriend and girlfriend in high school, and the three were known to have a really strong friendship.
They always have good grades. They had great aspirations to go to the university. So I think that brought them together.
They were the Three Musketeers, basically.
But as college drew near, it looked like the trio of friends would go their separate ways.
When it was time to go to college, Christian was going to the University of Florida. Rebecca was going to Santa Fe Community College, also located in Gainesville. And Pedro was accepted at Florida International University in Miami with a 4-year scholarship.
Christian couldn't have been more excited to start his college career and earn a degree. he decided to study biomedical engineering.
He wanted to help people with physical impediments that have lost their arms, extremities.
He was someone that really wanted to make a difference in this world, wanted to have an impact and help people.
In June, Christian made the move from Miami up to Gainesville and started settling into his new dorm for the summer session.
You don't realize until the moment that you are dropping him off in the university that he's gonna be leaving your house. And like I'm telling you that Christian was a little bit shy, so we have our doubts that he was going to be okay by himself.
Miami is about 5 hours away from Gainesville, so it can be kind of scary when you're not around the rest of your family, especially being that far away.
But around the 4th of July, Christian found a cure for his homesickness when he ran into his old friend Rebecca Johnson at an event in Gainesville.
They end up seeing each other July 4th at a fireworks demonstration on the campus of the University of Florida.
When they met at the 4th of July, it was fireworks between the two. It was instant fireworks.
In high school, Christian had seen Rebecca as a good friend who was dating his buddy, Pedro. But Rebecca tells Christian they'd recently split up.
At that time, she was no longer in relationship with Pedro, and so she was free to date.
And before long, romantic sparks between Christian and Rebecca ignited into flames. The old friends never went a day without calling, texting, or seeing one another in person.
She and Christian developed a very fast and intense relationship.
They had been friends for so long and were starting to create this electric romantic bond.
But now, just 2 months into the whirlwind relationship, Christian has seemingly vanished.
On this particular day, Rebecca had not heard from Christian in quite some time. It broke the routine. They always texted each other on a regular basis, and they saw each other almost every day.
Rebecca was so concerned about Christian, she enlisted his friend and her ex, Pedro Bravo, to help look for him.
Although Pedro originally planned to stay in Miami for college, he ended up moving to Gainesville just before the semester started.
Rebecca also calls Christian's parents to let them know what's going on.
She called us at 9 o'clock in the morning, letting us know that Christian was missing. I decided at that moment, something is wrong. Something was telling me, this is not Christian.
The family, as soon as Rebecca calls them and tells them that she doesn't know where Christian is, they immediately drive 5 hours to Gainesville because they are that concerned.
Perhaps on the middle of the way, he's gonna answer, he's gonna tell us I'm okay, and that's what our thoughts. But then with the progress on the road, we discovered that it was not going to be that easy.
However, campus police don't have to look far for their first potential clue. What immediately stands out is Christian's relationship to the people reporting him missing.
Rebecca says, I'm here because my boyfriend is missing. This is my ex-boyfriend, and he's the last person who was with him. And what we know in that moment is that there is something that is unusual here.
For 18-year-old Christian Aguilar, life couldn't have been better. He was pursuing a biomedical engineering degree at his dream university, and he'd just started dating a beautiful young woman he'd known since high school, Rebecca Johnson.
Both of them being recently in Gainesville and both of them being recently single, they end up starting to talk to each other and beginning a romantic relationship.
But now it's been almost 24 hours since anyone has seen or heard from Christian. And Rebecca has recruited her ex-boyfriend, Pedro Bravo, to help file a missing persons report with campus police. Like Rebecca, Pedro had known Christian since high school, and he'd recently joined them in Gainesville after transferring to Santa Fe Community College.
Pedro decides that he is foregoing his full-ride scholarship to FIU, and within days before the start of school, he registers at Santa Fe.
According to Pedro, he and Christian hung out the day before, but he hasn't seen or heard from him since that afternoon. And when police stop by Christian's residence hall, the mystery only deepens.
When the police go to Christian's dorm room, they talk to his roommate, who says that Christian did not return home the previous night.
What's especially strange is that Christian left his laptop sitting on his desk, something that, according to his roommate, he normally would have taken with him.
This was a young man who was making good grades and was very serious about what he was there to do. And so the roommate found it odd that the laptop was still in the dorm room.
Everything looked kind of undisturbed, and it just really did not make sense. All of Chris's things were there, but Chris wasn't there.
It began to unfold that this is a serious situation, and the University of Florida began a multifaceted effort to try and start making some quick decisions about what is going on here.
Suspecting Christian may no longer be on campus, the university hands the case over to the Gainesville police.
I was notified at like 1 o'clock in the afternoon because UPD felt like they needed to turn it over to us.
Detectives' first order of business is to get more detailed statements from Christian's two friends, Rebecca and Pedro. The investigators start with Pedro.
See if we can locate Christian or figure out where he may have been, please.
I started talking to Pedro at that time, asking, from the very beginning, what happened.
Tell me a little bit about where you were with Christian yesterday.
I called him up and he agreed to meet me Thursday at 2. He wanted to get the new Kanye West CD, so we went into the Best Buy and we looked around and we found the new Kanye West CD and he got it, and then we left.
I asked him what was the last thing that Christian was wearing as far as clothing, so we could put out a bulletin for him. And he told me that he was not sure. He might have been wearing a pullover shirt, might have been wearing jeans. He really wasn't sure.
What kind of shoes was he wearing?
I don't remember, but he wasn't wearing sneakers. He was wearing something like casual walking around shoes.
Pedro says he was more interested in catching up with his old friend than paying attention to his wardrobe.
It was like when you meet an old friend who's brought you like the best 4 years of your life through high school and has always been there.
After picking up the CD, Pedro says he and Christian went for a drive.
So we're driving around and we're talking, and at that point we saw a hitchhiker, just a random guy. A lot of people were passing by, but he had his thumb out, and we're like, why not? Because it'd be an interesting experience to pick up someone like that on the road.
Hey, you need a ride?
Pedro says they drive for about 10 or 15 minutes with the hitchhiker in the backseat of the car. And eventually the hitchhiker says, okay, this is my stop. I'm over here at this storage unit over here. So they let the hitchhiker out and then they go on their merry way.
Have a good one.
Pedro and Christian, they're now continuing to drive along after they've dropped off the hitchhiker. And Pedro says they got into kind of a deep emotional conversation.
I've been going through a very rough time because I've been contemplating suicide, and I almost attempted at one point. And I wanted to talk to him because I know he'd be one of the people that would really help me out.
Pedro says Christian tried to comfort him, but Pedro lashed out, and the discussion got heated.
I said, you don't understand what I'm going through. And he's like, I think I understand what I'm going through. And he got frustrated and angry at me, and he's like, stop the car, I want to get off.
His versions of the events has he and Chris having a verbal disagreement, and Chris simply saying, I'd like to get out of the car. Him stopping and saying, okay, see you later, bye.
In my mind, I'm like, fine, you don't want to help me? Don't help me. So I stopped the car and I let him get off and I drove away.
Christian got out of the car coming into the city limits of Gainesville. Pedro said that Christian had taken his backpack with him when he got out of the vehicle, and that's the last time he heard from him.
So where did you go after you dropped Christian off?
Then I drove back home and I wanted to go to sleep, so I took 4 sleeping pills. and knocked out.
Okay. You know about what time it was that you got home?
I got home at around 7:30, 7:45, around that time, something like that.
He said that he had taken some sleep medication, went to sleep that night, and about 3 o'clock in the morning he woke up because he got this telephone call from Rebecca saying that she couldn't find Christian, wanted to know if he would help her.
Now Pedro says letting Christian out of his car is something he deeply regrets.
I wish I could have kept driving and then like he'd be home right now, or he'd be doing something right now.
Where do you think Christian is right now?
But honestly, I just really hope he's lost. I'm gonna be really mad at him if he is lost, but I just really hope he is lost.
Seems like a long time to be lost, don't you think?
Yeah, I just hope something like he's okay.
But with every passing hour, there's a growing concern that Christian is not okay. And there's another nagging concern.
Pedro tells the detectives he wonders if possibly the hitchhiker could have done something or harmed Christian, since Christian was dropped off not too far from the storage unit facility.
It's a bizarre theory, but at this point, it's their strongest lead. One that detectives hope to corroborate before it's too late.
They suspect that something isn't right, but suspecting something isn't right is a long way from saying somebody is dead.
Chris, where were you? Just show up, please, just show up.
Gainesville police are speaking with college freshman Pedro Bravo about the disappearance of his friend, Christian Aguilar. According to Pedro, he and Christian picked up a hitchhiker shortly before Christian vanished.
He just wanted to be dropped off a little bit past 441, so we dropped him off at 441 at like a storage place.
Pedro says not long after that, he'd also let Christian out of the car, which leads to a chilling theory.
If he's been dropped off on the side of the road not too far from where the hitchhiker was located, then maybe the hitchhiker has something to do with Christian going missing.
Although he doesn't have a name, Pedro is able to provide a detailed physical description of the man.
He described this guy in detail from head to toe.
He had like a little knapsack with him and stuff like that, and he had like a white beard, and he had a little hat with him. I remember like a type of Santa Claus figure, but like if Santa Claus lost a lot of weight.
However, investigators can't help but notice something odd about Pedro's story.
You're reporting your lifelong friend missing. You're the last person who saw him. And you can't describe what he was wearing, but one guy that you gave a ride to, you can describe from head to toe. That was kind of a little red flag for me.
To get a better description of what Christian was wearing, detectives pulled surveillance footage from the Best Buy he and Pedro reportedly stopped at on the day he disappeared.
Chris is photographed purchasing a Kanye West CD, and so we know at this point he's wearing a light blue long sleeve shirt and some jeans.
Along with a description of the hitchhiker, police released Christian's photo to local law enforcement and media.
That's when I contacted more detectives and asked them to go to that area and start searching that area for Christian.
We had no evidence to go on, so we were listening to Pedro.
He was saying that he was okay and alive when he left them, and the location, and we start trying to find out what was that location so we can start going looking.
I remember hearing these parents unable to find their child and just screaming his name in the woods. It's a moment that will never leave my brain.
Back at the police station, investigators continue speaking with Pedro.
Is your car here?
Yes.
Do you mind if we take a look at it?
Go ahead.
Crime scene technicians go to the car and they look through the car They're not there to do a full forensic analysis of the car. They're just looking to see if there's anything that would help them determine where Chris is at that point. They locate a receipt at approximately 1 o'clock in the morning. He is buying some kind of meal at McDonald's.
So that's ringing alarm bells for police because Pedro told them that he went to bed early and took a bunch of sleeping pills.
Detective Roberts returns to the interview room and confronts Pedro about the receipt. But Pedro says he can explain.
I might have had like the midnight munchies, just like been really hungry and gone out, but I was really tired, so I don't remember exactly if I had out.
People who don't have anything to hide and don't have any reason to hide it usually remember if they get up at 1:30 in the morning from a dead sleep and go down to McDonald's and get something to eat. Okay, that really doesn't make sense.
Just another step in the little saga of making me believe that he may know a lot more than what he's telling us.
So Detective Roberts decides to try a different tactic with Pedro.
At the point where it looked like weren't going to get anything new for a little bit, I asked him if he would be willing to go with me to show me the route they drove, where they dropped off the hitchhiker.
You're going to be honest? Show me exactly where you left it.
Exactly.
Finally, faced with the reality of having to recreate his story on the spot, Pedro admits that he has not been completely forthcoming.
One thing I have to tell you, because you're right, I can't keep everything from you.
Florida police investigating the disappearance of UF student Christian Aguilar have been questioning his friend Pedro Bravo, who's now agreed to take them to the spot he says he last saw Christian. But along the way, Pedro makes a startling admission.
It's one thing that's gonna bug me if I don't tell you. When I was with Chris in the car, after we dropped off the hitchhiker guy, we were talking and things were so heated.
Detective Roberts takes the opportunity to address the obvious question. Was the rift between Pedro and Christian rooted in the love triangle with Rebecca?
I didn't ask you before, and I know we've touched on it, but I really want to know for my own personal knowledge.
I'm not gonna lie and be like she wasn't part of it. She was part of the equation.
And Pedro says when he confided in Christian about feeling suicidal over his breakup with Rebecca, Christian's response drove his anger into rage.
He said, no, you should just kill yourself.
Pedro says that he told Christian that he was feeling like he should kill himself, and Christian told him, go ahead.
At that point, I turned around and I just punched him in the face.
He says they both get out of the car and they engage in a physical fight.
You punched him in the face and things got out of hand.
He got hurt.
And you left him.
I asked him, well, if that happened, was Christian breathing when you left? And he goes, yes, but barely.
In my mind, I thought he was okay. I was like, he's probably fine.
This changes the whole ball game as far as the way this investigation is going. Now he's admitting that they got into a fight, he beat him up to the point of he was almost unconscious and he left him on the side of the road.
But when Pedro takes Detective Roberts to the location where he claims he left Christian, there's no sign of him.
There's no proof that there's ever been a fight. There's no blood. There's no Christian Aguilar. And there's no evidence that he was ever there.
And with no leads on the hitchhiker's identity, investigators suspect Pedro may have made that character up entirely.
They went to the location where he allegedly dropped him off, which had cameras, to see if they could ascertain any kind of identification of there actually being a hitchhiker. There was no proof that that person ever existed. Nobody reported such a person, sort of Santa Claus hitchhiking through Gainesville.
Still, for the sake of Christian's loved ones, they hold out hope that Pedro is leading them in the right direction.
We spent the rest of that night looking for Christian.
We got family in Miami. They came immediately. Grandma, my aunts, cousins, everybody came to the search.
Meanwhile, police turned back to the woman who first reported Christian missing, his girlfriend, Rebecca Johnson.
So I understand that you and Pedro were dating all through high school.
Yes.
Rebecca says when she and Pedro broke up after high school graduation, she was shocked by how he took it.
He was very distraught with the idea of us breaking up. He was kind of I don't care what you're feeling right now. I want to be with you, and nothing else is gonna matter.
Rebecca says that soon after her move north, she reconnected with Christian during the summer, and they started dating.
We always had a really close relationship. He considered me a best friend.
As the relationship between Chris and Rebecca evolves, Rebecca is very adamant that she does not want Pedro to find out. She's concerned that he might be depressed and upset, but someone showed Chris's Facebook account to Pedro Bravo. There were photographs of Chris and Rebecca together, and some of them could not be mistaken for anything other than people in a relationship.
That's when Pedro's behavior became really bizarre.
Even though he had a full ride to Florida International University in Miami, Pedro withdrew from the school at the last minute and enrolled in Santa Fe College in Gainesville, the same school Rebecca was attending.
At that point, I was just no, that's crazy. Normal people don't just pick up all their stuff and go up to Gainesville for a girl. It's very soap opera-like.
Well, it does happen to people. How do you think they come up with themes for soap operas?
It's a love triangle kind of story in a sense. It's a bit of a one-sided triangle.
And on the day Christian disappeared, Rebecca says he and Pedro were hanging out for the first time in a while to try and clear the air.
She knew that he was supposed to go over and meet Pedro and get picked up by him.
So when Christian went missing, it only seemed natural to enlist Pedro's help to find him.
Rebecca said the whole point of Christian and Pedro actually getting together that afternoon was to kind of reconcile that relationship.
Rebecca says despite Pedro's mental health issues, she didn't think he was capable of hurting anyone.
Was there any comments from him about him hurting himself?
Nothing about him hurting himself, and nothing about him
doing anything drastic,
No, nothing drastic.
But to the detectives, it sounds like Pedro had an ulterior motive. Clearly, he wasn't over his relationship with Rebecca, and Christian was the one person standing in the way.
As suspicious as police are at this point during the investigation, they still don't really have hard evidence to say that Pedro actually killed Christian.
However, since Pedro already admitted to beating Christian up and leaving him on the side of the highway, the police are able to formally charge him.
At that point, he was arrested for the criminal offense of failure to render aid to a person that you had harmed.
Convinced they're on the right track, investigators obtain a search warrant for Pedro's apartment.
We looked in the trash can. We found some, what I would call, cut open sleeping capsules.
They had all been sliced open and squeezed out.
And when police make their way to Pedro's closet, they unpack their most incriminating evidence yet.
We saw this luggage in there. Inside that was a briefcase. And when we opened the briefcase, it had Christian's driver's license, his student ID card.
They found receipts, and those receipts showed him purchasing diphenhydramine, a sleeping agent, and he's purchasing things like duct tape, razor blades, a shovel.
Police also find a journal in Pedro's bedroom, detailing his obsession with Rebecca.
He's written these obsessive, unhinged notes about how he wants to get Rebecca back. No one will stop him. Nothing's getting in his way.
It became pretty clear that Christian was never going to be found alive, and then there was some level of interest that this might be a bodiless prosecution because we didn't have a body.
I'm praying with everything that we got, and we have vigils and everything, so my faith was strong.
Then, after 3 weeks of searching in vain, a pair of hunters enter the woods in rural Levy County, about an hour southwest of Gainesville.
They are moving through this area and they smell decay.
After weeks of searching for 18-year-old Christian Aguilar, Florida police feel confident that the victim's romantic rival, Pedro Bravo, is responsible. And on October 12th, a pair of hunters in a remote area stumble across a chilling scent.
They are moving through this area and they smell decay.
They start looking closely and they realize there's a human skull here with other bones and tattered clothing.
The body is buried in an area that is rich with limestone in this very shallow grave.
Wildlife and vegetation and heat have clearly gotten to him, but detectives pretty much know that this has to be Christian.
The clothing that Christian was wearing matched the clothing on the body.
We had a forensic anthropologist, and he was able to make a positive identification right there at the gravesite from digital x-rays of Christian's dental work.
When his body is recovered, he has duct tape around his ankles, around his wrists, and we suspect that it was originally around his mouth.
Due to the extreme level of decomposition, the ME can't reach a conclusion about how Christian died. But based on the duct tape, one thing is apparent.
They did determine that it was a homicide.
Christian's body may have decomposed, but duct tape does not.
When detectives break the news to Christian's family, they're overwhelmed with grief.
He told me he's Christian. And at that moment I knew that was one of the most difficult experiences. That day, my life was shattered.
The outpouring of emotion in that room was nothing that I've ever experienced before, because they had, for about 3 weeks, their life had been just completely upended without any kind of answers of where their son was.
Following the discovery of Christian's remains, Pedro's charges are upgraded to first-degree murder.
In the run-up to Pedro's trial, police are contacted by an inmate at the Alachua County Jail named Wes Mercer. And he has a story to tell.
The jailhouse informant, through his lawyer, reached out to the assistant state attorney because he wanted a deal.
Wes Mercer comes forward and says that Pedro admitted to killing Christian.
He told me everything.
At first, detectives are skeptical of the informant. That is, until he starts revealing specific details about the investigation that only a guilty party would know.
Wes, the cellmate, says that Pedro told him that he laced Christian's sports drink with sleeping pills. Christian passed out, and then he said he got a tote strap and got in the backseat of the car and he strangled him. He explicitly said that it took 13 minutes for him to take his last breath.
That's when he was able to take Christian out to Levy County and then bury him in a shallow grave.
Wes's statement lines up with the evidence police have recovered. But what he says next takes them completely by surprise.
He's not done.
He's not done? What do you mean he's not done?
Pedro apparently wants to orchestrate this entire plan to commit even more murders from the jail.
Pedro spoke with him about wanting to harm or kill other students at the University of Florida.
Police in Gainesville, Florida are finally ready to prosecute Pedro Bravo for the murder of his former best friend, Christian Aguilar. But before Pedro's trial even begins, a jailhouse tip adds a bizarre wrinkle to the case.
He's not done.
He's not done. What do you mean he's not done?
He told us that Pedro Bravo wanted him to arrange for some of his friends to go out and commit another homicide or two, and to do it in the same manner that was used on Christian, to make it look like there was a serial killer loose in Gainesville.
This shows the demented mind of Pedro, where he comes up with this plot to say, help me create a serial killer, so that it appears that there's a serial killer out there, and then police will let me go because they'll believe that I didn't do it.
With a mountain of evidence piling up against him, Pedro Bravo goes to trial in August of 2014, almost 2 years after Christian's death.
The prosecutor's opening statement was that this is a case of jealousy, that Pedro was jealous of his ex-girlfriend's relationship with his friend Christian.
His intent was to get Rebecca back in his life as his girlfriend. The killing of Christian Aguilar was simply one part of that plan.
Since he had no prior record or history of violence, Pedro thought he'd easily get away with it.
It's truly unhinged, obsessive, and bizarre.
He's a sociopath.
Prosecutors say without any warning signs, Pedro set his psychotic plan in motion on the afternoon of September 20th, 2012.
Pedro had been trying to contact Christian to arrange for them to get together to have a conversation. Christian decided to go ahead and meet him, so Pedro picked him up in his vehicle.
Pedro laced a sports drink that he gave to Christian. He laced it with sleep medication. And so he watched as Christian got drowsy from this concoction that he made.
You okay, man? I'm gonna pull over.
He had acted like he needed to do something in the back seat, and he took a strap and wrapped it around Christian's neck and pulled and put his knees up against the back of the seat.
He used a moving strap to choke this young man, and he watched him die.
Once Christian was dead, Pedro drove west out of Gainesville to the middle of nowhere in Levy County.
He is going to be under the impression that he is so far out into this swampy area that no one is ever going to come. What he does not understand is that it is hunting season. This is a hunting lease.
As a shock to everyone, Pedro decides to take the stand in his own defense.
During his testimony of 4 hours, Pedro didn't crack. Pedro insisted on his innocence, and it appeared that he was very confident that he was going to be found not guilty and was going to walk out of court a free man.
You keep saying a lie, a lie, a lie, a lie, and it becomes true in his mind, not in ours. But that's what he's doing. It's Pedro being Pedro.
After a 2-week trial, it only takes the jury a few hours to render a verdict. Guilty.
We had charged him with 9 different counts, and he was found guilty of every one of those counts. 3 of those charges qualified him for a life sentence, and he was sentenced to life on every one of those counts consecutively. So 3 consecutive life sentences.
It was almost a deflation in the courtroom when the verdict was read. I felt and heard the Aguilars just finally let out that emotion that they had been bottling up for so long.
We were relieved, thinking that, now we can do our grieving.
It doesn't bring Christian back, but it was satisfying to know that we had done our job and that justice had been done for Christian.
But 11 years later, on March 12, 2025, that justice would be cut short.
At the age of 31, Pedro committed suicide in prison after battling his demons. His demons finally won.
This is a case that really sends chills down my spine, because it's the story of how someone just does not know how to let a relationship go.
On a summer afternoon in 1988, a little girl disappeared from the ordinary world and became the center of a mystery that would haunt Fort Wayne, Indiana, for nearly 3 decades. Her name was April Tinsley. She was 8 years old. She was a child whose life should have been measured in school days, family dinners, birthday candles, and the small adventures that make childhood feel endless. Instead, her name would eventually become attached to one of Indiana's most disturbing unsolved murder investigations, a case that survived years of dead ends, cryptic messages, false leads, technological limitations, and a killer who appeared to believe he could remain invisible forever. But the killer made one mistake. He left behind DNA. At the time, that biological evidence could not identify him. Years later, it would become the weapon that finally destroyed his anonymity. The story begins on a warm August day in 1988, when April was riding her bicycle near her home in Fort Wayne. There was nothing about the day that suggested history was about to change. Nothing announced danger. Nothing warned the people around her that a child was about to vanish from their lives. April was simply outside, moving through a familiar neighborhood, surrounded by places she knew. Then she disappeared. The search began quickly. Family members and authorities looked for her, hoping that the disappearance would have an innocent explanation. Perhaps she had gone somewhere unexpected. Perhaps she had become distracted. Perhaps she would return. But the hours passed. Hope began to collide with fear. Then the investigation took a horrifying turn. April's body was discovered in a rural area outside Fort Wayne. The discovery transformed a missing child investigation into a homicide investigation. Almost instantly, the question was no longer where April had gone. The question was, who had taken her and why? Investigators faced a crime scene without an obvious answer. A child had been abducted and killed, and whoever was responsible had managed to move her away from the neighborhood before leaving her body. The community was shaken. Parents looked at their children differently. Familiar streets suddenly seemed less safe. The case became a warning that danger could exist in places where people believed they were protected by familiarity. But the most important clue was not immediately visible. Biological evidence had been left behind. At the time, investigators could collect and preserve forensic material, but the technology available in the late 1980s was nowhere near what it would become decades later. A DNA profile could eventually be developed, but without a matching suspect. The profile could not provide a name. The killer, therefore, remained unknown. The investigation continued. Detectives followed leads. People were questioned. Possibilities were examined, but no suspect could be conclusively connected to April's murder. The case entered the long, painful category known as a cold case, and then something even more disturbing began to happen. The killer started communicating. Investigators received messages connected to the crime, and those communications added a chilling dimension to an already terrifying investigation. Instead of disappearing completely, the offender appeared to be reminding authorities that he was still out there. The messages were deeply disturbing because they suggested that the person responsible was not simply hiding. He was watching. He knew the investigation existed. He knew the authorities were searching for him, and he appeared confident that they could not identify him. For the families of victims, there is perhaps nothing more terrifying than knowing the person responsible may still be somewhere nearby, living an ordinary life while carrying the secret of an extraordinary crime. April's killer had become a ghost. Investigators knew his DNA existed. They knew someone had taken April. They knew someone had killed her, but they did not know his name. Years passed. The calendar moved forward. Children who had been April's age when she died became adults. The officers who had worked the original investigation grew older or retired. Technology transformed almost every part of modern life. Computers became more powerful. Communication changed. Genetic science advanced at an astonishing pace, yet April remained 8 years old in the historical record. Her photograph did not age. Her family carried the same law. And somewhere in Indiana, the person responsible continued living. The case became one of those investigations that never completely disappeared. Even when there are no dramatic new developments, cold cases remain open in the minds of investigators and families. A file can become quiet without becoming forgotten. Evidence can sit untouched without becoming meaningless. April's DNA profile remained a biological fingerprint of the crime. The killer had left something behind that he could not retrieve. He could avoid giving investigators his name, but he could not erase his genetic identity from the evidence. The problem was that the science needed to connect that identity to a person had not yet reached the necessary level of sophistication. In the years immediately following April's murder, investigators had to rely heavily on traditional police work. They needed witnesses. They needed admissions. They needed physical evidence that could be tied to an individual. They needed someone to make a mistake, but the killer seemed to have avoided the obvious mistake. There was no immediate confession. No reliable eyewitness stepped forward with a name that could solve the case. No direct DNA match appeared. The investigation gradually became more difficult as memories faded and leads weakened. Yet one thing remained unchanged: the biological evidence. That evidence would become increasingly important as DNA technology evolved. The concept was simple but revolutionary. Every person carries a unique genetic pattern. If biological material recovered from a crime scene can be connected to a suspect, investigators can establish a powerful forensic link. But in 1988, that science was still developing. The killer did not need to understand the technology to benefit from its limitations. He only needed to remain unidentified. And he did. For years, the investigation became a story of unanswered questions. Why April? How had the offender approached her? Where had he taken her? How long had he watched her? Had he chosen her randomly, or had he been waiting for an opportunity? Was he someone from the area? Someone passing through? Someone the community already knew? Investigators had theories, but theories are not proof. A cold case can survive for decades because there are too many possibilities and not enough evidence to eliminate them. The longer the case remained unsolved, the more difficult it became to separate reliable information from rumor. And then there were the messages. They were perhaps the most chilling element of the entire investigation because they suggested that the killer was not completely afraid of being caught. Instead, he appeared to be challenging authority. The communications created a psychological dimension to the case. Investigators were not simply searching for an unknown murderer. They were dealing with someone who appeared to understand the fear his actions created. The community wanted answers. April's family wanted answers. Investigators wanted answers. But the killer remained unnamed. The years became decades. The world entered the 1990s, then the 2000s, then the 2010s. Technology continued to evolve. DNA databases expanded. Forensic laboratories became more sophisticated. Investigators learned to extract more information from smaller and older biological samples. Cold case units began revisiting evidence that earlier generations of investigators had been unable to fully exploit. And slowly, the balance began to change. The killer had once depended on the limitations of science. Now science was catching up with him. The April Tinsley investigation was no longer trapped in 1988. It was entering a new era, but the breakthrough would not come from a dramatic confession or a mysterious stranger walking into a police station. It would come from the smallest possible clue: a genetic match, a connection hidden inside biological evidence that had waited for years to speak. And when investigators finally found the connection, the man who had remained invisible since April's death would suddenly have nowhere left to hide. The question was no longer whether the case could be solved. The question was how close investigators were to the answer and whether the killer had any idea that the technology he had once been able to ignore was now moving directly toward him. The investigation did not simply fade away after April Tinsley was found. It kept moving, sometimes loudly, sometimes almost invisibly, through years in which investigators had to confront the same terrible reality. They knew a child had been abducted and murdered. They had evidence connecting an unknown offender to the crime, and yet they did not know who that offender was. The case became more disturbing in 1990 when a message appeared on a barn door near Fort Wayne. The words claimed responsibility for April's murder and threatened that another killing could follow. The FBI later documented the message as one of the most extraordinary clues in the investigation, describing it as a message written by the murderer himself. That changed the atmosphere surrounding the case. Investigators were no longer dealing only with a crime committed in the past. They were confronted with the possibility that the person responsible was still present somewhere in the community and wanted them to know it. Imagine the psychological effect. A barn door becomes a crime scene. A few words become a warning. Every person living nearby suddenly becomes part of a terrifying equation. Who had access to that area? Who knew enough about the case to write such a message? Was the person who wrote it truly the killer? Or was someone deliberately attempting to mislead investigators? The message could not simply be ignored, but neither could investigators assume every word was truthful. It had to be treated as evidence, and beneath that evidence was the same biological clue that had been waiting since 1988. Attached to it, the killer had effectively left a biological signature without leaving an identity. That distinction would define the investigation for years. In the early stages, investigators had to rely on traditional methods. They returned to neighborhoods. They questioned people. They looked for suspicious behavior. They examined relationships, movements, possible motives, and opportunities. They tried to reconstruct April's final hours and determine how an 8-year-old girl could disappear from a familiar environment. But a murder investigation is rarely solved by one clue. It is solved when multiple clues intersect at the same person. The problem was, those intersections did not appear. Leads could be followed and then abandoned. Suspicious individuals could be examined and eliminated. The DNA could be tested, but without a match, it remained an anonymous profile. The case therefore developed a strange dual identity. On one side was the physical evidence, which suggested that the offender had left something behind. On the other side was the investigative reality, which offered no obvious person to whom that evidence could be attached. The killer had become a blank space, and blank spaces are difficult to prosecute. A detective can follow a person. A detective can interrogate a suspect. A detective can search a house under a warrant, but a detective cannot arrest an unknown DNA profile. The profile could tell investigators what kind of evidence they were looking for, but it could not walk into a police station and identify itself. So the case remained open. Then came another disturbing development. The killer appeared to have some understanding of the investigation and the fear surrounding it. The messages attributed to him became part of the case's mythology, but investigators had to remain disciplined. Every message had to be evaluated. Every claim had to be tested. Every possible connection had to be examined against the physical evidence. The danger in a case like this is that the offender can control the emotional atmosphere. A cryptic message can create panic, and panic can create assumptions. Investigators could not afford to let the killer dictate the investigation. They needed facts. And the strongest fact they had was the DNA. Years passed. The 1980s became the 1990s. The 1990s became the 2000s. Then another decade began. April's case survived all of them. The original investigators had worked without the tools available to detectives decades later. Computers were changing. DNA databases were growing. Forensic laboratories were becoming more sophisticated. New forms of genetic analysis were emerging, but technology did not immediately solve the case. A cold case can remain cold even when science improves because every advancement has limits. A DNA profile is useful only if investigators can find a meaningful comparison. A database search is useful only if the relevant profile exists within the database. A genealogy search is useful only if enough genetic information exists to establish a meaningful relationship. The science can open doors, but investigators still have to know which door to enter. In April's case, the breakthrough would eventually come from combining old evidence with new investigative thinking, but that moment was still years away. During the long silence, the case became part of Fort Wayne's collective memory. April's name remained associated with an investigation that seemed impossible to close. Her family carried the loss privately while investigators continued to carry the responsibility publicly. The passage of time created another problem. Memories weaken. People move. Neighborhoods change. Buildings disappear. Relationships shift. Someone who might have remembered seeing a suspicious person in 1988 may remember almost nothing decades later. A witness who once felt certain about a detail may no longer trust that memory. A person who knew something but was afraid to speak may eventually forget why the information mattered. Time is therefore both an enemy and a strange ally in cold cases. It destroys some evidence, but it can also produce new evidence. People eventually reveal secrets. Technology advances. Databases grow. Investigators develop methods that did not exist when the crime occurred. That second possibility would become critical in April's case. By the late 2000s, investigators were still actively trying to solve the murder. The FBI became involved in a renewed effort, and a specialized team worked alongside local authorities. In a detailed account of the investigation, the FBI described agents and local detectives conducting extensive neighborhood interviews, revisiting locations, and seeking DNA samples from possible suspects. 25 two-person teams worked day and night shifts as investigators attempted to breathe new life into the decades-old case. Think about what that means. Nearly 2 decades after April's death, investigators were still knocking on doors. They were asking residents what they remembered. They were searching for people who had lived in the area when the original crime occurred. They were looking for the smallest detail that might have survived the years. A face, a vehicle, a strange conversation, a person who suddenly left town, a person who behaved differently after April disappeared, a person who had been overlooked. The investigation was essentially rebuilding the past from fragments. But there was another reason those DNA samples mattered. Investigators were not simply asking possible suspects for biological material because they wanted to create a dramatic moment. They were attempting to compare genetic information against the unidentified profile connected to April's case. A match could change everything. A non-match could eliminate a person and narrow the field. Each sample, therefore, had value. Every elimination mattered. The process was slow because the potential suspect pool was enormous. The offender could have been someone investigators had already questioned. He could have been someone who had never attracted suspicion. He could have been someone who lived close to April, or he could have been someone who had moved through the area and disappeared from investigators' attention. The biological evidence did not reveal his biography. It only revealed his genetic identity. That was both powerful and frustrating. Investigators could know that the killer had left DNA while knowing almost nothing else about him. The FBI's renewed work demonstrated that the case had never truly been abandoned. It had been dormant in the public imagination, but investigators were still trying to generate new leads. The barn door message remained a haunting reminder of the offender's apparent confidence. The DNA remained a scientific fingerprint, and April's photograph remained the human face behind the investigation. Yet there was still no arrest, still no courtroom, still no name. The killer remained free. Then something began to change. Across the United States, forensic investigators were learning to think differently about DNA. It was no longer merely a tool for matching crime scene evidence against known suspects. Genetic information could be analyzed in ways that revealed relationships. Family connections could become investigative leads. The rise of forensic genetic genealogy would later revolutionize the way some cold cases were approached. Instead of asking whether the unknown offender was already in a criminal database, investigators could potentially ask whether his relatives were present in a genealogical database. That conceptual shift would prove crucial in cases where traditional searches had failed for decades. But before investigators could exploit that possibility, they needed to preserve the original evidence and continue treating it as valuable. That decision mattered enormously. The DNA recovered in April's case had been collected decades earlier, but it remained relevant because investigators had not simply allowed the biological evidence to disappear into history. It remained part of the case. Science was changing around it, and the possibility of a future breakthrough remained alive. Meanwhile, the killer had no reason to believe that the world of forensic investigation was about to change so dramatically. For years, he had benefited from anonymity. Every unsuccessful DNA search reinforced the illusion that the evidence could not identify him. Every year without an arrest could have strengthened his confidence. But an offender can mistake technological limitations for permanent protection. That is a dangerous assumption. Science moves. Databases grow. Investigators learn. A genetic profile that produces no match today can produce a match years later. The killer does not get to decide when the investigation ends. That decision belongs to the evidence. And April's evidence was still there. The case was still open. The DNA was still waiting. The unanswered questions were still hanging over Fort Wayne. Then, after decades of silence, investigators were finally going to find a way to make the genetic evidence speak more clearly. The man who had remained hidden since 1988 had spent years believing that the past was behind him. But the past had never left. It had been preserved inside a laboratory file, inside a forensic profile, inside evidence that could survive longer than memory. And the closer investigators came to understanding what that profile could reveal, the closer the killer came to hearing the knock on his own door. The years continued to accumulate, but the case never truly disappeared. April Tinsley remained a name on an unsolved homicide file, a photograph preserved in time, and a question that investigators refused to abandon. By the late 2000s, the investigation had already survived almost 2 decades, and the passage of time had made the original mystery seem even more difficult to penetrate. Yet investigators were still working. The FBI had become deeply involved, and the renewed effort brought new attention to evidence that had remained unresolved for years. Detectives returned to the neighborhood surrounding Fort Wayne. They spoke with residents who had lived there when April disappeared. They asked questions that had been asked before, but they asked them again because memories can sometimes unlock details only after years have passed. They looked for people who might have been overlooked, people whose names had never appeared in the original investigation, and people who might have known something but never realized its significance. The objective was brutally simple: find the person responsible for April's death. But there was another objective beneath it. Investigators needed to determine whether the mysterious communications associated with the case could be connected to the person whose DNA had been recovered. The messages were unsettling because they suggested a killer who was willing to remind authorities that he was still out there. One message, written on a barn door near Fort Wayne, claimed responsibility for April's murder and contained a threatening reference to another possible victim. The FBI later described the investigation surrounding that message in its account of the case. For investigators, the message was more than disturbing graffiti. It was potentially a direct communication from the offender. If they could establish that the writer and the killer were the same person, they might have another route toward identification. But the message also presented a danger. It could become a distraction if investigators allowed its psychological impact to overwhelm the physical evidence. The DNA remained the anchor. Everything else had to be tested against it. That principle became increasingly important as investigators revisited old leads. A person might appear suspicious. A story might sound convincing. A memory might seem important. But unless it could be connected to the evidence, it could not solve the case. April's DNA profile was therefore the silent standard against which every theory had to be measured. The unknown profile had existed for years, but its significance was about to grow dramatically. DNA technology was advancing rapidly. Laboratories were learning to obtain more information from smaller samples. Databases were expanding. Investigators were beginning to understand that genetic evidence could reveal relationships as well as direct identities. The concept of forensic genetic genealogy was changing the cold case landscape. For decades, investigators had generally asked whether an unknown DNA profile matched someone already known to law enforcement. But what if the offender had never been arrested? What if he had never provided DNA to a criminal database? What if he had no reason to believe his genetic information was already available to investigators? A direct search could fail forever, yet a relative could still provide the connection. That realization was revolutionary. The offender did not have to appear in a database himself. Someone related to him might, a cousin, a distant relative, someone carrying only a fraction of the same genetic history. From that relative, genealogists could potentially construct a family tree and begin narrowing the possibilities. The method required patience, expertise, and careful verification. A genetic relationship is not the same as proof of guilt. It can identify a family line, but investigators still need independent evidence connecting a specific individual to a crime. That distinction would become crucial in the April Tinsley investigation. The genetic profile associated with her murder had survived. The challenge was turning that profile into a person, And the longer the case remained open, the more investigators realized that conventional methods alone might never produce the answer. There were simply too many possibilities. The killer had disappeared into ordinary life. He did not have to confess. He did not have to contact investigators again. He did not have to leave another obvious clue. If his DNA did not match anyone in a traditional law enforcement database, the investigation could remain stuck indefinitely. But DNA had another property that made it different from most evidence. It could connect generations. A person's genetic identity is inherited. That meant that even if the killer himself remained invisible, members of his family could potentially create a trail toward him. The idea was almost unsettling in its simplicity. A man could avoid police databases, but he could not escape his ancestry. His genetic history had been passed down to him, and parts of that history could also be carried by relatives. If investigators could identify the right relatives, they might be able to work backward toward the unknown offender. By the 2010s, forensic genetic genealogy was becoming an increasingly powerful investigative tool. Cold cases that had resisted traditional methods were beginning to receive new attention. Investigators started to understand that old DNA profiles might have new value even when conventional database searches had failed. The technology did not change the original crime scene. It changed what investigators could do with the evidence recovered there. And April's case was exactly the kind of investigation where that difference mattered. The evidence was old. The suspect was unknown. The case had resisted conventional methods, but the biological profile remained. That made the case a candidate for the future of forensic investigation. Still, the road to that future was not immediate. Investigators had to continue working through traditional leads while the technology developed. The FBI and local authorities continued reviewing the case. They investigated possible suspects. They pursued information from the community. They tried to reconstruct what had happened to April. Every new lead carried the possibility of finally identifying the killer, but most did not survive scrutiny. That is the reality of cold case work. For every lead that produces a breakthrough, there may be dozens that produce nothing. Each false lead consumes time and resources. Each non-match eliminates one possibility, but does not necessarily create another. And each passing year increases the emotional pressure because the family is still waiting. April's family had no way to know when the answer would come. There was no countdown, no scheduled breakthrough, no guarantee that the investigation would ever be solved. The case could have remained unresolved indefinitely. That uncertainty is one of the cruelest aspects of a cold case. The family cannot move from uncertainty to certainty. They know someone is responsible, but they do not know who. They know the victim did not simply disappear, but they may not know why she was chosen. They may spend years wondering whether the person responsible is still alive, still nearby, still watching news reports, still aware that investigators have not given up. The possibility is psychologically exhausting. And in April's case, the communications attributed to the killer made that uncertainty even more frightening. The offender had seemingly inserted himself into the investigation. He had left words behind. He had demonstrated an awareness of the case, yet he still remained unidentified. That combination could make investigators feel as though they were chasing someone who was always one step ahead. But the truth was, the killer was not necessarily one step ahead. He was simply protected by the limitations of the available technology. The DNA already knew him. Investigators did not. That difference would eventually disappear. As databases grew and genealogical testing became more common, the possibility of finding a genetic relative increased. A family connection could suddenly appear where none had existed before. A distant relative could unknowingly provide the missing link. And once that link appeared, investigators could begin reconstructing a family tree. That is exactly why preserving old DNA evidence became so important. The value of evidence is not fixed. An item that seems limited in one decade can become enormously powerful in another. A biological sample that cannot produce a direct match may become useful through genealogy. A partial profile may become more informative as laboratory methods improve. A database search that fails today may succeed tomorrow because another person has entered the system. Time changes the investigative environment. April's case was waiting for that environment to change. Then came 2018. After 30 years, the case was about to experience the breakthrough that investigators had been hoping for. But the breakthrough would not arrive as a traditional suspect walking into the station. It would arrive through genetics. A genealogy search would reveal connections that investigators could follow. The unknown DNA would finally begin to point toward a particular family, and once investigators found the right branch, the anonymous profile would start becoming a person. The killer had survived for decades because nobody could attach a name to the DNA. Now that weakness was disappearing, the biological evidence was beginning to produce a trail, and that trail would lead investigators toward a man who had spent nearly 30 years living with a secret that he may have believed would never be exposed. The investigation was no longer moving blindly through the path. It was moving toward a specific individual. But before the final identification could occur, investigators would have to do something cold case detectives have learned to do again and again: return to the evidence, trust the science, and refuse to stop when the first answer appeared. Because in a case this old, a genetic lead is not the end. It is the moment when the real investigation begins. By the time the calendar reached 2018, the murder of April Tinsley had become the kind of case that seemed almost impossible to solve by traditional means. Nearly 30 years had passed since the 8-year-old girl was killed, and the investigation had already endured countless interviews, false leads, forensic examinations, and years of silence. Yet the biological evidence connected to the crime had survived. That evidence was about to become more powerful than anyone involved in the original investigation could have imagined. Investigators turned to forensic genetic genealogy, a technique that had begun transforming the way authorities approached unidentified DNA profiles. The concept was simple enough to understand but revolutionary in practice. Instead of searching only for the offender himself, investigators could search for genetic relatives. If the unknown profile could be connected to someone in a genealogical database, that relationship could become the first branch of a family tree. From there, investigators could work backward and sideways through generations, eliminating people who could not possibly be responsible and focusing on those who fit the emerging picture. In April's case, this approach finally created movement where traditional database searches had repeatedly failed. The unknown DNA was no longer simply an unidentified profile. It was becoming a family connection. The breakthrough did not happen because the killer suddenly made a mistake in 2018. His mistake had been made decades earlier when he left biological evidence behind. What changed was the ability of investigators to interpret that evidence. The same DNA that had once produced no name could now produce relationships, and relationships could lead to names. The process required caution. Genetic genealogy can point investigators toward a family, but it does not automatically identify a murderer. A relative is not a suspect simply because of shared DNA. Investigators must reconstruct the family tree, determine which individuals fit the relevant time period, examine their locations and circumstances, and then obtain independent evidence before making an arrest. That process was especially important in a case as old and emotionally charged as April's. Investigators could not afford to make another mistake. They needed certainty. They needed evidence strong enough to withstand the passage of time and the scrutiny of a courtroom. The genealogy work eventually narrowed the possibilities toward a man named John D. Miller. Miller had lived in the Fort Wayne area, and investigators began examining whether he fit the circumstances surrounding April's murder. He was not simply selected because his name appeared in a genetic family tree. The genealogical information provided the lead, and investigators then worked to establish whether his identity matched the biological evidence. That distinction would become critical. The investigation was moving from an anonymous profile to a specific person, but the scientific comparison still had to be performed. Investigators eventually obtained DNA from Miller and compared it with the biological evidence preserved from April's case. The result was the breakthrough investigators had been waiting for. The DNA matched. After nearly 3 decades, the unknown male profile had finally been identified. The killer had a name. The news was staggering because of how long the case had remained unresolved. April had been 8 years old when she died. Now, almost 30 years later, the investigation had finally reached the man whose DNA connected him to the crime. The identification demonstrated the extraordinary power of forensic genetic genealogy, but it also exposed something else. The killer had not been invisible because there was no evidence. He had been invisible because the evidence had not yet been connected to his identity. That difference is fundamental. The biological trace had existed all along. The science simply needed time to catch up. Once Miller was identified, investigators could begin examining the broader circumstances surrounding him. They could look at his history, his movements, his connection to the area, and his potential relationship to the evidence. They could compare the genetic result against the rest of the case. They could also examine whether the mysterious communications associated with April's murder could be connected to him. The investigation now had a person at its center, but the detectives still needed to establish the complete evidentiary picture. A cold case cannot be solved simply by finding someone whose DNA matches. The circumstances must be reconstructed. The suspect's identity must be confirmed. The evidence must be documented. Prosecutors must be able to explain how the pieces fit together. And in April's case, investigators had another extraordinary piece of information to consider. The killer had apparently communicated with authorities years earlier. The barn door message had become one of the most disturbing elements of the investigation. If the same man responsible for April's death had written those words, then the communication could provide another link between the past and the newly identified suspect. But investigators had to be careful not to let the emotional power of the message overwhelm the forensic evidence. The DNA was the anchor. Everything else had to be measured against it. The breakthrough also raised an unsettling question. What had Miller been doing during the nearly 30 years between April's murder and his identification? He had lived through an entire generation without being identified as the offender. Children who were alive when April died had become adults. Technology had transformed daily life. The internet had become part of everyday existence. Genetic testing had moved from specialized laboratories toward consumer databases. And all the while, the evidence connecting Miller to April's murder had been waiting in storage. The passage of time may have given him confidence that the case would never be solved, but time had also created the technology that would eventually expose him. That is one of the great ironies of cold cases. The same decades that separate investigators from the original crime can also create the tools necessary to solve it. Time weakens memories, but it expands databases. Time scatters witnesses, but it advances science. Time can bury a case in old files, but it can also produce a breakthrough that investigators in the original era could never have imagined. April's murder became a textbook example of that paradox. The case had survived because the evidence survived. When genetic genealogy entered the investigation, the old evidence suddenly became new again. Investigators could finally ask the question they had been unable to answer for years: whose DNA was this? And the answer came back with devastating clarity. John Miller. The unidentified profile had a name. The name belonged to a man living in the same region where April had disappeared. The investigation was no longer searching an endless field of possibilities. It was focused. Detectives moved quickly. They continued gathering evidence while preparing for the possibility of an arrest. The community, which had lived with the mystery for nearly 3 decades, was about to receive news that many people had stopped expecting. The case was not going to remain unsolved forever. The man responsible was about to be confronted with the evidence he had left behind. There is something almost poetic about the way the breakthrough occurred. The killer had apparently believed that the passage of time protected him, but time had not destroyed the evidence. It had strengthened the tools used to read it. The genetic information that had once been anonymous had become a map. That map led to relatives. The relatives led to a family tree. The family tree led to Miller, and the direct DNA comparison closed the circle. The investigation had moved backward through generations to identify a man in the present. A biological clue left in the 1980s had traveled through laboratories, databases, and family records until it reached the 21st century. The killer had not escaped the evidence. He had simply survived long enough to see the evidence become more powerful. And now the authorities had something they had lacked for nearly 30 years, a name backed by science. But identifying Miller was not the same as proving every detail of what happened to April. Investigators still had to establish the case in court. They had to confront the legal process. They had to ensure that the DNA evidence was properly documented and that the chain of evidence could withstand scrutiny. They had to determine what additional evidence could support the prosecution, and they had to confront the possibility that the suspect might deny responsibility. The genetic match was extraordinarily significant, but a successful prosecution required more than a dramatic headline. It required a case that could survive the courtroom. The investigation, therefore, entered a new phase. The mystery had become a prosecution. The unknown offender had become a defendant, and April's family, after almost 30 years of waiting, was finally approaching the moment when the legal system could publicly identify the man responsible for her death. The case that had begun with a child's disappearance in 1988 had crossed into an entirely different era. The original investigators could never have known how the case would eventually be solved. The technology they would need did not yet exist. The databases were not large enough. The genealogy methods were not developed. The investigative tools were not available, yet the evidence remained. That was the constant. April's DNA remained. The killer's biological signature remained. And eventually, science caught up with the truth. When investigators announced the identification of John Miller, the shock was not simply that a suspect had been found. It was that the answer had been hidden for so long in something microscopic. A trace of DNA had outlived decades of silence. It had survived the death of memories, the movement of people, the retirement of investigators, and the transformation of technology. And now it had finally spoken. The question that remained was what would happen when the man whose DNA had ended the mystery was brought into court. The investigation had crossed the most difficult boundary, from unknown to known, but justice still required another step. The evidence had to be placed before a judge and jury. The family would have to hear the case described in public. The defendant would have to face the consequences of a crime committed when April was only 8 years old, and the community would finally have the opportunity to see whether the decades-old mystery could truly reach its final chapter. The silence had been broken. The DNA had delivered its answer. Now the courtroom would have to decide what that answer meant. The name was John D. Miller. But a name alone could not close a 30-year-old murder investigation. Investigators had spent decades trying to identify April Tinsley's killer, and they understood the danger of moving too quickly. A genealogical lead could point toward a family, perhaps even toward a small group of relatives, but it was not itself a conviction. The investigators needed direct evidence. They needed to know whether the man standing at the center of their new theory was actually the person whose DNA had been recovered from April's case. That meant surveillance, patience, and a carefully planned forensic comparison. By the summer of 2018, investigators had narrowed their attention to Miller and his brother. The genetic genealogy work had produced a family connection, but detectives still had to determine which brother, if either, was the source of the crime scene DNA. One of the brothers was no longer alive, leaving the investigation focused on the surviving possibilities. The detectives did not immediately confront Miller. They watched. They studied his movements. They examined his connection to the area and compared what they knew about him with the evidence that had accumulated since 1988. The situation was extraordinary because the investigation was now moving in two directions at once. The old evidence pointed toward an unknown male. The genealogical research pointed toward a family. Traditional police work had to bridge the gap between those two facts. The detectives needed a sample from Miller that could be compared directly with the biological evidence recovered from April. They did not simply knock on his door and ask him to provide one. Instead, investigators obtained DNA from discarded material, including items recovered from his track. According to accounts of the investigation, detectives recovered used condoms from Miller's garbage and obtained a DNA profile from them that matched the profile associated with April's case. Suddenly, the investigation had crossed a line it had been trying to reach for nearly 3 decades. The genealogical lead had identified a possible family. The surveillance had narrowed the possibilities. The forensic testing now connected Miller directly to the biological evidence. The unknown man was no longer unknown. The evidence pointed toward John Miller. The detectives now had to move carefully. They had spent years knowing that the killer was somewhere beyond their reach. Now they believed they had finally located him. But an arrest had to be supported by evidence strong enough to survive legal scrutiny. The DNA comparison was central. The old biological evidence had not been forgotten. It had been preserved. The new sample provided the direct connection investigators needed. The significance of that moment is difficult to exaggerate. For 30 years, April's case had contained a genetic clue without a name. Now the name had been attached. The case had moved from speculation to identification, and Miller had no apparent idea that investigators had reached him. On July 15, 2018, detectives went to Miller S. Mobile, home in Grabille, Indiana. The moment was quiet. There was no dramatic chase, no barricade, no public confrontation. The man who had remained unidentified for almost 30 years was approached at his own home. Investigators asked him to accompany them to the police department. He agreed. Once he was in custody, detectives read him his rights and began asking questions. Then came a moment that would become one of the most chilling details of the entire case. They asked Miller whether he knew why they were there. According to accounts of the interrogation, he answered with 2 words, April Tinsley. That response changed the atmosphere immediately. Investigators did not have to explain the name. Miller already knew. The question was why. Why did he know exactly what the detectives wanted to discuss? Was it because he had followed the case for years? Was it because he had remembered what he had done? Or was there another explanation? The detectives continued. They asked him to explain what had happened. At first, he hesitated, but according to investigators, he eventually began describing the events surrounding April's abduction and murder. His statements provided information that investigators could compare against evidence from the original case. A confession, however, was not the beginning of the case. The DNA evidence had already brought investigators to Miller. His statements became another layer of evidence. This distinction mattered. The investigation had not started with a confession and then searched for evidence to support it. It had started with decades-old forensic evidence moved through genetic genealogy, narrowed to a family, and then used direct DNA testing to identify a suspect. Only after that did Miller provide his account. The sequence was powerful because multiple independent pieces of information were converging on the same person. Investigators now had a biological link and statements from the man they had identified. For April's family, the news was devastating and relieving at the same time. For nearly 30 years, there had been no name to attach to the crime. Now there was one. The man responsible was not a mysterious figure who had vanished into another state or disappeared into another identity. He had remained in the region. He had lived an ordinary life while the investigation continued around him. The realization was difficult for the community to absorb. A person who had been living nearby had carried the secret for decades. The case had been discussed publicly. The killer had apparently followed developments, and yet nobody had identified him. That was one of the most painful aspects of the breakthrough. The answer had been closer than anyone imagined. Investigators later learned that Miller had lived in the Fort Wayne area for years. The geography mattered because it placed him within the same broader environment as the original crime. The genealogical evidence pointed toward him. The DNA confirmed him. His own statements connected him to April. The pieces that had remained separate for decades suddenly formed a coherent picture. And then there was the disturbing history of the messages. Years after April's murder, girls in the Fort Wayne area received threatening communications connected to the case. Investigators eventually determined that DNA associated with some of those materials matched the DNA connected to April's murder. That meant the same biological signature could potentially connect multiple events separated by years. The killer had not simply vanished after April's death. The evidence suggested that he had continued to insert himself into the story, leaving behind messages and biological traces. The significance of that became clear only after investigators had identified Miller. What had once looked like the work of an unknown predator could now be examined through the identity of a specific man. Investigators could ask new questions. Where had he lived? Who knew him? What did neighbors remember? What places had he frequented? What had he done in the years following April's murder? Every question had new meaning because there was finally a name at the center of the investigation. The arrest also brought attention to the extraordinary role played by forensic genetic genealogy. Just months earlier, the killer had been an unidentified DNA profile. Now he was sitting in an interrogation room. The transformation seemed almost impossible, but the science had not produced a magical answer. It had created a lead. Investigators had then done the difficult work of verification. This is one reason the April Tinsley case became so important in the history of investigative genealogy. It demonstrated that an unidentified crime scene profile could be connected to a family tree, then narrowed through conventional police work, and finally confirmed through direct DNA testing. The process offered a model for other cold cases. If evidence had been preserved, a case that seemed impossible could potentially be reopened with modern tools. The arrest also represented something else, the end of the killer's ability to hide behind anonymity. For nearly 30 years, investigators could describe the offender only through evidence and theory. Now they could describe him by name. But a name is not justice. An arrest is not a conviction. The legal process still had to begin. Prosecutors would have to present the evidence. Miller would have legal representation. The case would move through hearings and negotiation. The families would eventually have to face the possibility of a trial where the details of April's murder could be discussed publicly decades after the event. And there was another difficult question. Would Miller admit responsibility in court, or would he fight the charges? The DNA evidence was powerful, but the prosecution still had to build a legally sustainable case. The arrest, therefore, marked the beginning of another chapter rather than the end of the investigation. Yet for the first time since April disappeared in 1988, the family could look at the case and see a possible conclusion. The unknown killer had been identified. The biological evidence had finally done what investigators had hoped it would do. A tiny genetic trace had survived nearly 3 decades of silence and led detectives to a man living in Indiana. The killer had not been found because he suddenly became visible. He had been found because science had learned how to see him. That distinction would become one of the defining lessons of the case. The evidence had been waiting all along. The technology had simply needed time to catch up. And now that technology had placed John D. Miller directly in front of investigators. The question that remained was no longer who the killer was. That question had been answered. The question was what the courts would do with the evidence, what Miller would admit, and how April's family would finally confront the man whose identity they had spent almost 30 years wondering about. The silence had ended, but the most difficult part was still ahead. The arrest of John D. Miller transformed the April Tinsley case from a decades-old mystery into an active criminal prosecution almost overnight. For nearly 30 years, investigators had been searching for a name. Now they had one, but the moment of identification did not erase the past. It forced the past into the present. Every unanswered question that had remained buried since 1988 suddenly demanded attention. Investigators had to reconstruct what happened to April, examine Miller's statements, establish the forensic evidence, and determine how the strange communications associated with the case fit into the larger picture. For April's family, the arrest carried an emotional weight that was difficult to describe. They had spent decades wondering whether the person responsible would ever be found. Now the mystery had a fate. The person who had been an anonymous killer for almost 30 years was sitting in custody, yet there was no way to reclaim the years that had passed. April was still 8 years old. The world around her had changed completely. The people who had searched for her in 1988 were now older. Some had retired. Some were gone, but April's family still carried the original loss. The arrest did not create the grief. It simply gave the grief a new focus. Investigators now knew they were dealing with a man whose DNA matched the evidence from the crime. But they also needed to understand what Miller would say about it. When detectives confronted him, they already possessed the most important scientific evidence. The biological profile connected to April's case had been compared with DNA obtained from Miller and produced a match. That was the foundation. The interrogation would determine whether Miller would offer an explanation, deny responsibility, or describe what had happened. Instead, according to investigators and later court records, he eventually confessed. The confession became another major piece of the case. It was not simply the words of an unidentified suspect. It was the statement of a man whose DNA had already been linked to the crime. The order mattered. Investigators had followed the evidence to Miller. They had not forced a confession and then tried to manufacture a connection. The DNA had led them there first. That made the interrogation especially significant. Miller was confronted with evidence that had been preserved for nearly 3 decades. The science had removed the shield that time had provided. The case had become impossible to escape. Miller's eventual admissions helped investigators reconstruct aspects of the crime that had remained uncertain for years. He acknowledged responsibility for April's abduction and murder, according to accounts of the investigation. The confession also provided investigators with information that could be compared against details already known. In a cold case, that kind of corroboration is essential. Investigators are not simply looking for an emotional admission. They need statements that can be tested against physical evidence, timelines, location, and facts that were not publicly available. The more independently verifiable details a confession contains, the more valuable it becomes. In April's case, the confession came after the DNA match, meaning the biological evidence remained. The central forensic link. The investigation had finally reached a point where science and human admission were pointing in the same direction, but another disturbing element now demanded attention. The messages that had appeared years earlier, the communications connected to April's case, had always been among the most unsettling clues. One of them had appeared on a barn door and claimed responsibility for April's murder. Other threatening messages were later associated with young girls in the area. The killer seemed to be deliberately inserting himself into the investigation. After Miller's identification, investigators could finally examine those messages through the lens of a known suspect. The question became whether Miller's DNA was present on evidence connected to those communications. According to investigative accounts, it was. DNA associated with some of the messages matched the biological profile linked to April's murder. That connection was chilling because it suggested that the same offender could be linked not only to April's murder, but also to the threatening communications that had terrified the community. The messages had once been words without an identifiable author. Now investigators had a biological link to a specific person. The case was no longer an abstract mystery. It was becoming a coherent forensic narrative. The DNA connected Miller to the crime. The genetic genealogy connected him to the family line. The additional biological evidence connected him to communications associated with the investigation, and his own statements provided another layer. The evidence was converging from multiple directions. This convergence was particularly important because cold cases can be vulnerable to uncertainty. A single clue can be challenged, a witness can be mistaken, a confession can be disputed, a genealogical relationship can be misinterpreted. But when independent forms of evidence point toward the same individual, the case becomes significantly stronger. That was what investigators had achieved. The biological evidence from the original crime scene pointed toward Miller. The genetic genealogy had helped identify him. Direct DNA testing confirmed the connection. His statements reinforced the investigators' conclusions. The messages provided another possible connection. The mystery that had survived for decades was finally beginning to collapse under the weight of accumulated evidence. Yet the case remained deeply disturbing because of what it revealed about the passage of time. Miller had apparently lived for years without being publicly identified as April's killer. He had gone through ordinary routine. He had interacted with people. He had existed within the same society as everyone else. Meanwhile, investigators in April's family continued to carry the unresolved case. That contrast is one of the most difficult realities of long unsolved crimes. The victim's family experiences the passage of time through absence. The offender experiences it through ordinary life. One side remembers the moment everything changed. The other side may spend decades hoping the truth will remain buried, but the evidence does not experience time the way people do. DNA remains DNA. A biological profile does not become less accurate because 20 years have passed. If anything, advances in technology can make old evidence more valuable. April's case demonstrated that principle with extraordinary clarity in 1988. The biological evidence could not identify the offender. In 2018, modern genetic genealogy and DNA testing could connect that same evidence to a living man. The evidence had not changed. The investigative environment had. That is why cold case investigators repeatedly emphasize preservation. Evidence that appears limited today may become decisive tomorrow. a laboratory technique that does not exist today, may be routine years from now. A database that contains no useful relatives today may contain several tomorrow. The April Tinsley case was a dramatic demonstration of that reality. For decades, the DNA profile remained an unanswered question. Then the right technology arrived. The genetic genealogy investigation provided a family connection. The family connection provided investigative direction. Traditional police work narrowed the possibility. Direct DNA testing provided confirmation. The arrest followed. And then the confession added another layer. The entire sequence showed how modern forensic investigation can bridge enormous gaps in time. But there was still a human story beneath the science. April was not a DNA profile. She was a child. She had a family. She had a personality, a voice, a future that was supposed to continue. Every scientific development in the case mattered because it was ultimately about answering what happened to her. The danger of focusing too heavily on forensic technology is that the victim can disappear behind the evidence. Investigators knew that April had to remain at the center. The DNA mattered because it could tell them who had been responsible for taking her life. The genealogy mattered because it could transform an unknown profile into a person. The arrest mattered because it could bring the case into court. But none of those things could restore April. Justice could identify the offender. It could not return the child. That distinction would remain present throughout the prosecution. The legal case would eventually force everyone involved to confront the details of what had happened decades earlier. April's family would hear the story again. The community would hear it again. The defendant would face the consequences, and investigators would have the difficult task of explaining how the case had remained unsolved for so long. The answer was partly technological. The science available in 1988 was limited compared with what investigators could use 30 years later, but the case also demonstrated the importance of persistence. The investigation had not been erased by time. It had been preserved. Detectives continued to pursue leads. The FBI returned to the case. DNA evidence was maintained. New forensic methods were considered. Eventually, genetic genealogy opened a path that traditional methods could not. The lesson was clear. A cold case is not necessarily a dead case. Sometimes it is a case waiting for the right method. April's case had waited nearly 30 years, and when the right method arrived, the killer's anonymity disappeared with astonishing speed. In the space of months, the investigation moved from an unidentified DNA profile to a named suspect, from suspect to arrest, and from arrest to confession. The contrast was extraordinary, nearly 3 decades of silence, then a rapid sequence of breakthroughs. The killer had spent years protected by the limitations of forensic science. Once those limitations disappeared, the investigation accelerated. The case was now moving toward court. Prosecutors had a DNA match. They had evidence connected to the communications. They had Miller's statements. They had a forensic genealogy trail showing how investigators had arrived at him. The courtroom would become the next stage, and for April's family, that meant something they had waited almost 30 years to hear. The name of the person responsible would finally be spoken in a legal setting, not merely whispered as a theory. The mystery had been solved scientifically. Now justice had to be established publicly. The case had survived decades because one tiny clue survived with it. That clue had been invisible to the public, meaningless without the right technology, and silent for almost 30 years. But when investigators finally learned how to read it, it pointed directly toward John Miller. The killer had believed time was protecting him. Instead, time had created the science that would expose him. And now there was nowhere left for the truth to hide. The courtroom phase of the April Tinsley investigation carried a different kind of tension because, for the first time, the evidence collected over decades had to be translated into a legal case that could withstand scrutiny. The investigation had begun with a child disappearing in 1988 and had moved through years of uncertainty. But now prosecutors had something investigators had never possessed before: an identified defendant and a DNA trail connected him to the crime. John D. Miller was no longer an unknown figure somewhere beyond the reach of investigators. His identity had been established through forensic genetic genealogy and then confirmed through direct DNA comparison. The science had transformed the case, but the law still demanded proof. Prosecutors had to show not simply that Miller's DNA was connected to April's case, but that the evidence established his responsibility for what happened to her. That meant presenting the story carefully, piece by piece, allowing the jury and the court to understand how an investigation that had remained unresolved for almost 30 years had finally reached a specific man. The prosecution could begin with the oldest evidence. April was 8 years old when she was killed. Her death generated a biological profile associated with an unknown male. For decades, that profile remained unidentified. Traditional searches did not produce a name. Investigators continued working the case, but no suspect could be conclusively linked to the DNA. Then, forensic genetic genealogy changed the investigation. The unknown profile was analyzed through genealogical methods, producing a family connection that directed investigators toward Miller. But the genealogy did not end the investigation. It began the final stage. Detectives watched Miller and obtained discarded biological material that could be compared with the original profile. The comparison produced the result investigators had been waiting for, a direct DNA match. The unknown male was identified. This sequence was crucial because it demonstrated that the investigation had not simply selected a convenient suspect. The suspect had been identified through a biological trail that began at the original crime scene. Once the direct match was established, investigators confronted Miller. He was taken into custody in July 2018. The interrogation produced another major development. Miller acknowledged knowledge of April's murder immediately when investigators told him why they were there, and he eventually confessed to the crime. His statements provided investigators with information that could be compared against the physical evidence. A confession alone can sometimes be complicated, but here it existed alongside the DNA evidence that had already led investigators to him. The scientific evidence and the defendant's own statements were pointing in the same direction. The case also contained another layer that made it particularly disturbing. The communications associated with April's murder had been part of the investigation for years. A message written on a barn door claimed responsibility for April's murder. Later communications threatened young girls in the Fort Wayne area. These messages had always been frightening because they appeared to come from someone who wanted investigators to know he was still free. Once Miller was identified, investigators could revisit those communications with a new question. Who had written them? Biological evidence associated with some of the communications was reportedly consistent with the same DNA profile connected to April's murder. That meant the messages were no longer just mysterious words. They could potentially be tied to the same biological source as the original crime. The implications were enormous. The killer had not merely disappeared after April's death, he appeared to have remained engaged with the fear surrounding the case. He had left messages that forced investigators and the community to remember that an unidentified offender was still somewhere nearby. For nearly 30 years, those messages had been pieces of a puzzle with no face attached to them. Now, investigators had a person whose DNA could potentially connect the pieces. The case therefore became more than an old homicide. It became a forensic reconstruction of a crime that had resisted identification for almost an entire generation. The courtroom would have to examine that reconstruction. Prosecutors would have to explain the science of DNA. They would have to explain genetic genealogy without allowing the concept to become confusing or sensationalized. They would have to show how investigators moved from an unknown profile to a family connection, and then from that family connection to a direct DNA match. They would have to demonstrate that the biological evidence had been preserved properly and that the comparison was reliable. And they would have to place Miller's statements within the larger evidentiary framework for the defense. The question would be whether any part of that chain could be challenged. But the scientific foundation was formidable. The DNA evidence had been generated from material connected to the original investigation, and the later comparison identified Miller as the source. The genealogical work had provided the investigative lead, but the direct DNA test was what converted that lead into forensic identification. That distinction would become one of the most important lessons from the case. Genetic genealogy can point investigators toward a person, but traditional forensic testing is what can establish the direct biological connection. The April Tinsley investigation demonstrated both stages. First came the family tree, then came the DNA match. The technology had done something that traditional police work had been unable to accomplish for nearly 30 years. It had transformed anonymity into identity. Yet for April's family, the science was only part of what mattered. They had waited decades to know who had taken their child. The arrest finally gave them that answer, but it also forced them to revisit memories that had never truly disappeared. The murder had happened in their past, but the prosecution brought the past into the present. Court proceedings meant hearing April's name again and again. They meant seeing evidence connected to the crime. They meant hearing investigators describe what they had learned. They meant knowing that the man responsible was finally being held accountable. That process could be emotionally overwhelming. Closure is often described as though it were a single moment, but in homicide cases, it rarely works that way. A family may experience relief when an arrest is made, then anger when details emerge, then grief all over again when the crime is discussed publicly. The passage of time does not make those emotions disappear. It simply changes how they are experienced. April's family had lived through decades without an answer. Suddenly, they were confronted with the reality of the answer. The man responsible was not a rumor. He was a defendant. He had a name. He was in court. The case also carried a broader significance because of the role played by genetic genealogy. By 2018, the technique was beginning to gain international attention because it had been used to solve other difficult cases involving unidentified DNA profile. The method offered investigators a way to approach cases where conventional databases had failed. Instead of searching only for the offender, they could search for relatives. That expanded the investigative possibilities dramatically, but the April Tinsley case showed that the technology worked best when combined with conventional detective work. Genealogy produced a list. Investigators then performed surveillance, obtained a direct DNA sample, and confirmed the connection. They did not simply declare someone guilty because a distant relative appeared in a database. They followed the evidence. That careful process helped make the breakthrough legally meaningful. It also demonstrated why cold case investigations often require multiple disciplines. Geneticists, genealogists, detectives, forensic analysts, prosecutors, and investigators can all contribute different pieces of the same puzzle. No single technique solved April's case. The breakthrough emerged because those techniques were combined. That is why the case became so important to the evolution of modern cold case investigation. It showed that a decades-old biological profile could remain valuable even when conventional searches had failed. It showed that family relationships could provide investigative direction. It showed that discarded DNA could confirm a genealogical lead. And it showed that a confession could then provide additional context. The investigation had moved through several distinct layers, but they all pointed toward the same conclusion. The killer was identified. The legal process now had to determine the consequences. Miller's case eventually resulted in a guilty plea. He pleaded guilty to murder, child molestation, and confinement charges connected to April's death. The plea brought the case toward its final legal stage without requiring the full uncertainty of a jury trial. For April's family, the plea meant that the person responsible had formally accepted criminal responsibility in court. After nearly 30 years, the case had reached a point that once seemed impossible. The name of the killer was known. The evidence had been publicly examined. The defendant had admitted guilt, and the sentence would determine how the legal system responded. But even as the prosecution moved forward, another question remained in the background. Why had the case taken so long? The answer was not that investigators had stopped caring. It was that the evidence required technology that did not exist when April was killed. The DNA profile was there. The investigation was there. The questions were there. What was missing was the bridge between the biological evidence and the identity of the offender. Genetic genealogy became that bridge. Once it was available, the decades-old case accelerated with astonishing speed. The man who had remained unidentified for almost 30 years was found within months of the genealogical breakthrough. The contrast was striking. Decades of silence followed by a rapid collapse of the mystery. That pattern is increasingly familiar in cold case investigations. A case can remain stagnant for years and then suddenly move at extraordinary speed when a new piece of technology creates a viable lead. April's case was one of the clearest examples. The killer had not changed. The evidence had not changed. The science had, and that was enough to alter everything. The courtroom now held the final responsibility. The evidence that had been silent for decades had finally spoken. The question was whether the legal system would translate that evidence into punishment. For April's family, that moment carried enormous weight. They had waited since 1988. The world had moved on around them, but their question had remained. Who killed April? Now they knew, and soon they would know what sentence the law would impose. The mystery had ended. The consequences were about to begin. The guilty plea brought a strange kind of silence to a case that had been filled with questions for almost 30 years. For decades, investigators had asked the same fundamental questions. Who took April Tinsley? Who killed her? Who left the messages that terrified the community? Who was the unknown man behind the DNA profile? Now the answer had a name. John D. Miller had been identified through a combination of forensic genetic genealogy, traditional investigative work, and direct DNA comparison. The biological evidence that had remained unidentified since 1988 had finally led investigators to the man responsible. But for April's family, the end of the investigation could never be as simple as a courtroom announcement. The legal process could establish guilt. It could impose punishment. It could officially record what had happened, but it could not reverse the moment when April's childhood ended. She remained 8 years old forever, while everyone else continued aging around the memory of her. That contrast was at the center of the case. The investigation had taken almost 3 decades to reach its conclusion, but April herself never had another day. Her family had spent years carrying unanswered questions, and suddenly those questions had answers that were difficult to hear. Miller's guilty plea meant there would be no prolonged trial in which every detail had to be fought over before a jury. Instead, the case moved towards sentencing with the central question already established. The man whose DNA had been connected to April's murder had admitted responsibility. The investigation that had once seemed destined to remain unresolved had finally reached a legal conclusion. Yet the extraordinary path to that conclusion remained one of the most important parts of the story. It was not simply that a killer was found. It was how he was found. For almost 30 years, traditional searches had failed to produce a direct identification. Then investigators turned to genetic genealogy. The unknown DNA profile was analyzed for familial connections. Those connections eventually directed investigators toward Miller. The genealogy itself was only a lead, but it was a lead that traditional methods had not produced. Investigators then performed the work necessary to confirm it. DNA obtained from Miller was compared against the evidence from April's case. The profiles matched. That direct comparison transformed the genealogical lead into forensic evidence. The man investigators had been searching for was no longer an abstract possibility. He was the biological source connected to the crime. Then came the interrogation. Miller was confronted with the evidence. He eventually confessed. The sequence mattered. It showed how modern cold case investigations can operate when old evidence is combined with new technology. The process begins with something that may have been collected decades earlier. It moves through scientific analysis. It produces an investigative lead. Detectives then verify the lead using conventional methods. Finally, the suspect faces the evidence. April's case became one of the clearest demonstrations of that process. The DNA did not magically solve the murder. It opened a door. Investigators walked through it. They followed the family connection. They identified Miller. They obtained a direct sample. They confirmed the match. They confronted him. And the decades-long mystery finally collapsed. But the case contained another disturbing layer that could not simply be forgotten. The threatening communications associated with the investigation had terrified the Fort Wayne community for years. A message on a barn had claimed responsibility for April's murder. Later messages were directed at young girls. Those communications suggested that the offender was not content to remain completely silent. He appeared to be reminding people that he existed. For investigators, that behavior created a chilling question. Why would a killer who had successfully avoided identification risk communicating with the public? Was it arrogance? A desire for control? A need to relive the crime? Or a belief that investigators would never be able to connect the messages to him? Whatever the motivation, the messages became part of the psychological landscape of the case. Parents worried about their children. Girls in the area became the recipients of terrifying warnings. The case was no longer simply a murder from 1988. It had become a continuing source of fear. Once Miller was identified, investigators could finally examine those communications with a different perspective. The biological evidence associated with some of the messages provided another connection to the same DNA profile. That made the communications even more disturbing because the anonymous writer could now be understood as part of the same forensic story. What had once been a mysterious voice had an identity. The words on the barn were no longer simply words. They were potential evidence connected to a man whose DNA had been recovered from April's case. The transformation was remarkable. For years, investigators had been trying to understand the offender through behavior. Now they could identify him through biology. Behavior could be interpreted in different ways. DNA could provide a direct connection. The evidence had finally become personal. The killer had spent decades as an unknown figure. Now his identity was known. The family could hear his name. Investigators could place him within the case file. Prosecutors could build a legal argument around him. And the community could finally understand that the man responsible was not some invisible stranger who had disappeared into the darkness. He was a real person who had lived through the same decades as everyone else. That realization is one of the most unsettling elements of many cold case investigations. People imagine an unidentified killer as someone constantly running, changing names, hiding from police, or living a life filled with fear. Sometimes that happens, but sometimes the reality is much more ordinary. The offender remains in society. He works. He has neighbors. He shops. He speaks to people. He grows older. He watches the world change, and the case remains unresolved in the background. The biological evidence, however, waits. That was exactly what happened with April's case. Miller could lie through the years, but he could not change the genetic evidence connected to him. The DNA preserved the truth of the crime even while human memories faded. That is why investigators repeatedly returned to forensic evidence. Witnesses can forget. Records can disappear. People can die. But biological evidence, if properly collected and preserved, can remain useful for decades. The technology used to interpret it may change, but the evidence itself can remain. April's case proved that principle with extraordinary force. The profile generated from evidence connected to her murder had remained unidentified for almost 30 years. Then the world of genetic genealogy provided a new method, a technique that had not existed in anything like its modern form when April was killed became the key to identifying her offender. The case, therefore, became part of a larger transformation in criminal investigation. Genetic genealogy began allowing authorities to investigate unidentified DNA profiles by tracing family relationships. Instead of asking only whether the offender had been arrested before, investigators could ask whether one of his relatives had voluntarily placed genetic information into a database. That was a profound shift. Criminal investigators were no longer limited to the boundaries of law enforcement DNA databases. The family itself could become the investigative pathway. The April Tinsley investigation demonstrated the power of that approach. The killer had not placed his own DNA into a police database, but his genetic relatives created the path that eventually led investigators toward him. That concept would later become increasingly important in other cold cases around the United States. But with every technological breakthrough comes responsibility. Genetic genealogy must be handled carefully. A familial connection does not automatically mean guilt. Investigators must verify every lead. They must distinguish relatives from offenders. They must protect the integrity of the evidence. And they must obtain direct confirmation before making a criminal accusation. April's case demonstrated why that distinction mattered. The genealogy produced a direction. The direct DNA comparison provided the forensic confirmation. The investigation then moved forward. That careful process was essential because the consequences of getting it wrong could be enormous. In a murder investigation, a mistaken identification can destroy an innocent person's life while allowing the real offender to remain free. The history of criminal justice contains examples of wrongful accusations created by weak or misunderstood evidence. April's investigators had to avoid repeating that kind of failure. The strength of their case came from the convergence of multiple forms of evidence: the genetic genealogy, the direct DNA match, the additional biological evidence, the communications, the interrogation, the confession. Each piece added weight to the others. And when Miller entered his guilty plea, the decades of uncertainty finally reached a legal endpoint. But even then, the emotional question remained. What does closure actually mean for a family that has waited almost 30 years? Does knowing the killer's name erase the nightmares? Does knowing the circumstances make the loss easier to understand? Does seeing the defendant punished make the years of uncertainty disappear? There is no simple answer. Closure is not a switch that turns grief off. It is often a gradual change in the nature of grief. Before the arrest, the family carried uncertainty. After the arrest, they carried knowledge. Those are different burdens. Uncertainty asks questions endlessly. Knowledge forces people to confront the answer. April's family finally had the answer to the most painful question of all. The man responsible had been found. The DNA had identified him. The legal system had accepted his guilt, and the case that had haunted Fort Wayne for almost 30 years could finally be remembered not as an unsolved mystery, but as a murder that had been solved. Still, one thing remained impossible to change. April had been 8 years old in 1988. She would never experience the decades that followed. She would never see the world transform. She would never grow older, graduate, build a career, form friendships as an adult, or create a family of her own. Those possibilities were stolen before they could happen. The investigation could establish what happened to her, but it could never show what her life might have become. That is why the final legal resolution could never be the whole story. The real story was April herself. The science mattered because it brought truth to her case. The arrest mattered because it gave the family an answer. The guilty plea mattered because it established responsibility. But beneath all of it was the same photograph that had been present since the beginning. A little girl, a life interrupted, a family waiting, a mystery that lasted almost 30 years, and a tiny genetic clue that refused to disappear. The killer had believed that time was on his side. It was not. Time had preserved the evidence. Time had expanded the databases. Time had created new technology. And eventually, time turned the smallest clue in the case into the weapon that ended the silence. For April Tinsley's family, the guilty plea represented something that had seemed almost impossible for most of their lives. The legal system had finally placed responsibility for April's murder on a specific person. The unknown offender who had haunted investigators since 1988 was no longer an unidentified DNA profile, no longer a shadow behind threatening messages, and no longer a name missing from an old case file. John Miller had been identified, arrested, and had admitted responsibility. But the extraordinary conclusion of the case did not erase the decades that had come before it. Instead, it forced investigators, the community, and April's family to look backward through nearly 30 years of unanswered questions and understand how the case had remained unsolved for so long. In the earliest days after April disappeared, investigators had no modern genetic genealogy. They had no way to search consumer ancestry databases for distant relatives of an unknown offender. The biological evidence could be preserved, but the technology needed to turn that evidence into an identity did not yet exist. The FBI later documented how investigators repeatedly returned to the case, including a major effort in which agents and local detectives recanvassed neighborhoods, conducted interviews, and sought DNA samples from possible suspects. The investigation was active. It was not abandoned. But activity and resolution are not the same thing. Detectives can knock on thousands of doors and still find no answer. They can interview witnesses whose memories have faded. They can follow leads that seem promising and watch them collapse. They can compare DNA against available databases and receive no match. And they can continue doing all of it while knowing that somewhere an unknown offender may still be living freely. That was the reality surrounding April's case for years. The investigation generated leads, but the crucial connection remained missing. Then the world changed. Genetic genealogy became a new tool in forensic investigation. Unlike a conventional law enforcement DNA database, forensic genetic genealogy can use DNA data from non-law enforcement databases to identify potential relatives and construct family trees. The FBI explains that forensic genetic genealogy differs from traditional familial searching and can be used to identify relatives of an unknown offender. For a case like April's, that distinction was transformative. Investigators did not need Miller himself to have been previously arrested or entered into a law enforcement database. They needed a genetic pathway to his family. Somewhere in the expanding world of genetic data, that pathway could exist. Once investigators found it, the mystery began to narrow. The breakthrough was not a dramatic discovery at the original crime scene. Nothing suddenly appeared in the grass. No forgotten witness walked into a police station with a confession. Instead, the breakthrough came from something invisible to the human eye: inherited genetic information. A distant biological connection became a clue. That clue became a family tree. The family tree became an investigative lead, and the lead eventually pointed toward Miller. The case then returned to old-fashioned police work. Investigators had to verify what the genealogy suggested. They could not simply assume that the person identified through family connections was the killer. They had to determine whether the suspect fit the evidence. They needed a direct DNA comparison. That comparison became decisive. The biological evidence from April's case matched Miller's DNA. The anonymous profile had finally been given a name. That was the moment when the case fundamentally changed. Before the match, investigators were searching for an unknown man. After the match, they were investigating John Miller. Every piece of evidence could now be reconsidered through that identity. The threatening messages could be examined again. Miller's history could be examined. His location could be examined. His statements could be examined. The original evidence could be compared with the new evidence. The case was no longer a search through an endless landscape of possibilities. It had become a focused investigation. And then came the interrogation. Miller reportedly knew why investigators had come for him. That detail became one of the most unsettling aspects of the arrest because it suggested that the case had not been forgotten by the man investigators believed was responsible. The detectives had spent years trying to remember every detail of April's disappearance. Now they were speaking to someone who knew exactly what they were talking about. Eventually, Miller confessed. The confession gave investigators another source of information to compare with the evidence. But the DNA remained critical because it was independent of his words. It was physical evidence. It had existed before Miller was identified. It had existed before the interrogation. It had existed before investigators knew his name. That independence gave it extraordinary power. The evidence had essentially identified its own source. The confession came later. The genetic profile had been there first. That is what makes the case so significant in the history of forensic investigation. It demonstrates how an investigation can move from an unidentified biological profile to a suspect without relying on a direct database hit. The old method asked a relatively narrow question. Does this DNA match anyone already known to authorities? The new method asked a broader question. Who might be related to this DNA? That difference can open doors that previously remained locked, but the technology also raises profound questions about privacy and the boundaries of investigative genealogy. When people voluntarily upload genetic information to ancestry databases, they are generally looking for information about their own family history. They may want to find relatives, explore ancestry, or construct family trees. They may never imagine that their genetic information could indirectly help investigators identify a distant relative suspected of a violent crime. That tension has become an important part of the broader discussion surrounding forensic genetic genealogy. Yet in April's case, the technique provided the critical investigative path. The family connection did not replace traditional evidence. It helped investigators locate the person whose DNA could then be tested directly. That distinction is essential. The genealogy did not convict Miller. The direct evidence and subsequent legal proceedings established the case. The genealogy was the bridge. For April's family, however, none of those technical distinctions could change the fundamental truth. Their child had been taken from them. For almost 30 years, they had not known who was responsible. Now they did. The knowledge could be devastating, but uncertainty had ended. The family no longer had to wonder whether the killer would ever be identified. They no longer had to imagine that the person responsible might die without ever being named. They no longer had to live with the possibility that April's case would remain permanently unresolved. The arrest had changed the future, even though it could not change the past. The community also had to confront a difficult reality. The killer had been among them. For years, residents had lived with the memory of April's murder and the disturbing messages that followed. Parents had heard warnings. Children had grown up knowing about the case. The mystery had become part of Fort Wayne's collective memory, and then suddenly the mystery had a face. That revelation can create a strange mixture of relief and fear. Relief because the unknown offender has finally been identified. Fear because the realization comes that the person may have been closer than anyone imagined. The old questions acquire new meaning. Who had seen him? Who had spoken to him? Who had unknowingly crossed paths with him? How many ordinary moments had occurred while the investigation remained unresolved? The answers to those questions were painful precisely because they could never be fully reconstructed. Time had erased too much, but the scientific evidence had preserved enough. That was the remarkable paradox of April's case. Human memory had weakened, but DNA had endured. Witnesses could forget conversations, locations, or dates. DNA could remain unchanged. Investigators could retire. Databases could evolve. Technology could become obsolete and then be replaced by something more powerful, but the biological evidence remained waiting for a method capable of interpreting it. That is why the story is not simply about a killer who was eventually caught. It is about the extraordinary lifespan of forensic evidence. Evidence can outlive investigators. It can outlive suspects. It can outlive entire generations of technology, and sometimes, decades later, it can suddenly become the most important evidence in the case. April's murder demonstrated that reality with terrifying clarity. The clue that ended the mystery was tiny. It could not speak. It could not identify itself. It could not tell investigators where to look, yet it carried a genetic signature unique enough to eventually point toward the man responsible. The case had waited almost 30 years for investigators to learn how to read that signature. Once they did, the silence collapsed rapidly. The investigation became a model for what could be possible in other cold cases. Thousands of unresolved crimes around the country contained biological evidence that had once been considered insufficient to identify an offender. If modern technology could unlock even some of those profiles, investigators might be able to revisit cases that families had been forced to live with for decades. But there was another lesson. The breakthrough depended on evidence that had been preserved. Without the original biological material, genealogy would have had nothing to work with. The technology could not create evidence from nothing. It could only extract new information from what investigators had preserved. That is why the earliest investigators remained an important part of the story. They had collected and maintained evidence without knowing whether it would ever lead to an identification. They could not know that decades later, genetic genealogy would transform its value. Their work created the foundation for the future breakthrough, and so the investigation that began in 1988 eventually became a bridge between two very different eras of forensic science. In the first era, investigators searched neighborhoods, questioned witnesses, examined physical evidence, and waited for a database match that never came. In the second era, genetic genealogy allowed investigators to search beyond conventional databases, trace biological relationships, and narrow the field until one man remained. The difference was not a change in the crime, it was a change in what science could reveal about the crime. And that may be the most haunting part of April Tinsley's story. The answer had been there all along. It had been sitting inside evidence collected decades earlier. The killer had not escaped the evidence. He had only escaped identification. For years, that distinction meant freedom. Then, one tiny genetic clue changed everything. The years after April Tinsley's murder had created an illusion that the case might never be solved. Each passing year seemed to place another layer of distance between investigators and the crime. The people who had first searched for April grew older. Witnesses moved away. Memories became less precise. The original headlines disappeared from newspapers and were replaced by newer tragedies. Technology changed almost beyond recognition, yet the evidence remained. That was the contradiction at the heart of the investigation. Time appeared to be working against justice, but in the end, time also delivered the technology that made justice possible. The identification of John D. Miller demonstrated that a cold case can remain alive even when there are no new witnesses, no obvious suspects, and no dramatic discovery. Sometimes the most important development is simply the ability to examine old evidence in a completely new way. By 2018, that possibility had become reality. Investigators had taken an unidentified DNA profile associated with April's murder and used genetic genealogy to search for biological relatives. The resulting family connection gave them a direction. They did not stop there. They investigated. They watched Miller. They obtained biological material. They compared the new sample with the old profile. The match was decisive. Suddenly, the anonymous offender had a name. The arrest followed. Then came the confession. The case had traveled from mystery to identification with astonishing speed after decades of apparent stillness. But the investigation was not simply about catching one man. It became a demonstration of how modern science could change the fate of unresolved cases across the country. Before genetic genealogy, investigators searching for an unidentified offender generally had to hope that the person had already been arrested, convicted, or otherwise entered into a searchable DNA database. If there was no match, the evidence might remain unidentified indefinitely. Genetic genealogy created another possibility. An offender might never have entered a police database, but his relatives could still appear in a genealogical database. The offender's identity could then be inferred through family relationship. This approach changed the question. Instead of asking, "Who is this person?" investigators could begin by asking, "Who is related to this person?" That sounds like a small difference. In a cold case, it can be enormous. A direct search might produce nothing. A family tree can produce dozens of possibilities. Those possibilities can be narrowed through age, location, relationships, and other investigative facts. Eventually, the field can become small enough for detectives to identify the person whose DNA should be tested. That is essentially what happened in April's case. The genealogy did not provide a courtroom verdict. It provided a path. Detectives followed that path until they could obtain direct evidence. That distinction is important because forensic genealogy has sometimes been portrayed as though investigators simply type a DNA profile into a website and receive a murderer name. The reality is much more complicated. Genetic data can identify relationships, not guilt. Investigators must build family trees. They must evaluate multiple possibilities. They must eliminate people who could not have committed the crime. They must consider geographic and temporal factors. And most importantly, they need independent evidence connecting the final suspect to the crime. In April's case, the direct DNA comparison supplied that confirmation. The old evidence and the new sample matched. The biological connection was established. The case had finally crossed the line from investigative theory to forensic identification. Miller's subsequent confession added another layer. The man investigators had identified through DNA eventually admitted responsibility. That sequence gave the prosecution an unusually strong foundation. The evidence did not depend entirely on a confession. It did not depend entirely on genealogy. It did not depend entirely on a witness. Multiple forms of evidence converged. That convergence was critical because April's murder was so old. The older a case becomes, the more difficult it can be to rely on human memory. Witnesses may remember the broad outline but forget precise details. Documents can be lost. People can die. Circumstances change. Physical evidence, therefore, becomes increasingly important. In April's case, the biological evidence had survived the years. The evidence did not forget. It remained available for new analysis. That is why the preservation of evidence became one of the quiet heroes of the story. The investigators who handled the case in the 1980s could not have predicted the future. They could not know what genetic genealogy would become. They could not know that decades later, an investigator would be able to use the preserved biological material in a completely different way. But they preserved it. That decision eventually made the breakthrough possible. The case also revealed how the passage of time can affect a community. For years, April's murder remained a local wound. The crime was remembered by people who had been children themselves when April disappeared. Parents remembered the fear that spread through the area. Children learned that something terrible had happened to a girl not much older than themselves. The unidentified offender became a symbol of danger because nobody knew who he was. The threatening messages intensified that fear. The killer seemed to be communicating from the shadows. The community could not see him, but the messages made his presence feel real. That is what makes anonymous offenders so psychologically powerful. A known criminal can be placed behind bars. An unidentified one can exist anywhere. The absence of a face allows fear to fill the empty space. Once Miller was arrested, that psychological uncertainty disappeared. The community could finally understand that the person responsible had been identified. But the revelation also created a new kind of shock. The killer was not some supernatural figure. He was a human being. He had lived through the years when people were still talking about April's murder. He had existed while the case remained open. He had aged while April remained forever 8. That contrast is difficult to comprehend. The victim's life ended instantly. The offender's life continued for decades. He experienced ordinary days that April never received. He watched technology change. He watched the investigation remain unresolved, and eventually he watched that same technology become the reason investigators found him. The very passage of time that appeared to protect him ultimately became the mechanism of his exposure. By the time Miller was arrested, forensic genealogy was becoming one of the most discussed developments in cold case investigation. Investigators around the United States were beginning to recognize its potential. Cases once considered impossible could be reopened if biological evidence remained available. April's case became one of the examples demonstrating what was possible. The significance extended beyond one family or one city. It showed that an unidentified offender could be traced through relatives even when conventional criminal databases had failed. It demonstrated that the boundaries of forensic investigation were changing. The DNA profile had not become more human. The technology had become more sophisticated, and that distinction mattered. Science did not create the truth. It revealed information that had been present all along. The killer's genetic signature had existed from the moment the biological evidence was deposited. It was investigators' ability to interpret that signature that changed. This is one reason cold cases can be so unpredictable. A case may appear frozen, but it is not necessarily dead. New technology can suddenly change what the evidence means. A fingerprint that could not be matched decades ago may become identifiable when a new database is created. A digital device that was unreadable may become accessible with modern software. A DNA profile that produced no match may become useful through genealogy. The evidence remains the same, but its investigative value can change dramatically. April Tinsley's case became a powerful illustration of this principle. The investigation had spent years trying to identify an unknown offender. Then genetic genealogy provided a route that traditional methods had not. The breakthrough was so significant that it helped demonstrate why agencies increasingly began considering genetic genealogy when traditional DNA searches failed. But there was another side to the breakthrough. The case showed that the passage of time can never be treated as proof that justice is impossible. A killer may believe that witnesses will forget. He may believe investigators will retire. He may believe the public will move on. He may believe evidence will become useless, but science can invalidate those assumptions. The evidence may wait. The technology may improve. A database may expand. A relative may submit genetic information. A new investigator may notice something that previous investigators could not, and suddenly the entire case can move. For April's family, that movement came after almost 30 years of waiting. The arrest did not restore what had been lost, but it answered the central question. Someone was responsible. That person had been identified. The evidence was real. The legal system could finally respond. The family no longer had to wonder whether April's case would become another forgotten cold case buried beneath decades of unsolved files. The case had a conclusion, yet there remained an unavoidable emotional reality. A legal conclusion is not the same as emotional closure. April's family had lived with her absence for decades. They had built their lives around a loss that could never be repaired. Knowing who killed her could not erase birthdays that never happened, milestones she never reached, or memories that never had the opportunity to grow. The arrest could only answer one question. It could not answer what April's life would have looked like if she had survived. That question would remain forever unanswered, and perhaps that is why the story continues to resonate. It is not simply a story about DNA. It is not simply a story about a detective breakthrough. It is a story about time, evidence, and the persistence of memory. April's name remained in the investigation because people refused to let the case disappear completely. Investigators continued to preserve the evidence. Her family continued to wait. The science continued to develop. Eventually, all those threads converged. The killer had spent nearly 3 decades believing that the distance between 1988 and 2018 was protection. It was not. Every year that passed brought the world closer to the technology capable of identifying him. The clock was not his ally. It was counting down toward the moment when the evidence would finally speak. And when that moment arrived, it did not come with a dramatic confession in the darkness or a mysterious stranger suddenly appearing at a police station. It came through a genetic connection, followed by careful police work and a direct DNA match. The smallest clue became the largest breakthrough. A case that had seemed trapped in the past suddenly became a modern forensic success story, and the message was impossible to ignore. Time may bury a crime beneath decades of silence, but it cannot necessarily bury the evidence with it. The conviction of John D. Miller did not erase the mystery that had surrounded April Tinsley for nearly 3 decades. Instead, it finally allowed investigators to look back at the entire case with the identity of the offender known. For years, every clue had existed without a name. The biological evidence pointed toward an unknown man. The threatening messages suggested an offender who was still watching the investigation. The community lived with the fear created by a killer who appeared to have disappeared into ordinary life. Then genetic genealogy changed the direction of everything. Once investigators identified Miller and confirmed the DNA match, the old evidence could finally be understood as part of one continuous trail. What had once seemed like disconnected fragments began to form a single picture. The significance of that transformation went far beyond one arrest. It demonstrated how a case that had resisted traditional investigation could suddenly become solvable when science created a new way to interpret evidence. April's case had begun in 1988, when investigators were operating with forensic tools that now seem primitive by comparison. DNA testing existed, but the database's computing power, genetic genealogy techniques, and widespread ancestry databases that would eventually become important to the investigation did not. Investigators could preserve biological evidence, but preservation was essentially an investment in the future. They could not know exactly how valuable that evidence would become. They could only make sure it remained available. Decades later, that decision proved critical. The biological evidence was still there when investigators needed it, and because it remained intact, new science could be applied to an old crime. That is one of the most important lessons hidden inside April's story. A cold case is not necessarily a case without evidence. Sometimes it is a case with evidence that has not yet revealed everything it contained. For almost 30 years, April's DNA evidence had been an unanswered question. Investigators knew that a male genetic profile was associated with the crime. They searched available databases. They pursued suspects. They investigated leads. But the profile did not produce the identity they needed. Then the rules changed. Genetic genealogy gave investigators another route. Instead of searching only for the offender himself, investigators could search for biological relatives. A relative could become the doorway to a family tree. A family tree could become an investigative map, and that map could eventually point toward the person whose DNA needed to be tested. This method was especially powerful because it did not require the killer to have a criminal record. He did not have to have been arrested previously. He did not have to have voluntarily submitted his own DNA to a law enforcement database. His family history could still expose the connection. That was the weakness Miller could never overcome. His identity might have remained hidden from conventional searches, but his genetic heritage was not something he could erase. The genetic genealogy process eventually led investigators toward his family. From there, detectives continued with conventional investigative work. They did not simply accept the genealogical lead as proof. They observed Miller. They obtained biological material. They compared it with the DNA profile connected to April's murder. The result confirmed what the genealogical investigation had suggested. Miller was the source of the DNA. The case had finally crossed the threshold from possibility to certainty. Then, investigators confronted him. The moment was extraordinary because the man who had remained unidentified for almost 30 years was suddenly sitting across from detectives who knew something he had managed to keep hidden. He knew April's name. He knew why the investigators were there. And eventually he admitted responsibility. His confession became another piece of a case that was already supported by physical evidence. The confession was important, but it did not create the case. The DNA had already led investigators to Miller. This distinction is essential when examining the investigation. A confession can be challenged. A suspect can claim that investigators misunderstood his words. Memories can be disputed. But the biological evidence existed independently of Miller's statements. It had been collected decades before he was identified. It had no reason to point toward anyone except the person whose DNA it contained. That evidence had remained silent while the investigation struggled. Then modern technology gave it a voice. The result was devastatingly precise. Miller was no longer simply a suspect. He was connected to the crime through biological evidence that had survived almost an entire generation. The investigation also revealed how the threatening messages had affected the case. The communications had created an atmosphere of fear around Fort Wayne. They suggested that someone connected to April's murder was still willing to communicate with the public. For investigators, the messages were both evidence and psychological pressure. They could not ignore them. They could not assume they were genuine. They had to determine who had written them and whether they were connected to the offender. Once Miller was identified, the messages could be examined through a new lens. Biological evidence associated with communications linked to the case provided another connection to the same genetic profile. That development gave the investigation an even more disturbing dimension. The offender was not simply a name hidden in an old file. He had apparently left traces of himself in multiple places. His biology had become the invisible signature running through the investigation. The words could be erased. The messages could disappear. Memories could fade. But the DNA remained. The community had spent years fearing an unknown offender. Now they could finally understand that the fear had been attached to a real person. That realization brought relief, but it also brought difficult questions. How had he remained unidentified for so long? Had he believed the case would never be solved? Did he understand how close investigators were getting? Did he ever imagine that a technology based on genetic relatives would eventually lead police to him? There is no way to know exactly what Miller believed during those years, but the timeline itself is revealing. In 1988, the crime occurred. 4 years afterward, investigators worked without a direct identification. Then technology advanced. Genetic genealogy emerged. Investigators found a family connection. Direct DNA testing confirmed Miller. Within a remarkably short period, the mystery that had endured for decades was broken. The case demonstrated that the passage of time can produce an unusual paradox for criminals. Every year may make memories weaker, but every year may also make technology stronger. A person who believes that an old crime is becoming irrelevant may actually be moving toward a future in which the evidence becomes easier to analyze. That is what happened here. The killer did not become careless in the traditional sense. He did not necessarily leave a dramatic new clue. The world simply became better at reading the clue he had already left. That is perhaps the most frightening lesson for anyone who believes time guarantees safety. Evidence does not have to become newer to become more powerful. It only needs a new method of interpretation. April's case became an example of this principle because the key evidence had been waiting since the original investigation. The future supplied the tools. The past supplied the evidence. Together, they produced an answer. For investigators, the case also became a reminder of the importance of persistence. Cold case work can be emotionally exhausting. Detectives may spend years examining evidence that produces nothing. They may inherit cases from investigators who have retired. They may revisit the same facts repeatedly. They may have to explain to families why there is still no answer. But the absence of a breakthrough does not mean the investigation is worthless. Every preserved piece of evidence becomes part of the possibility of a future breakthrough. Every properly documented sample can become useful when technology advances. Every investigative record can help a future detective understand what was already tried and what remains possible. April's case benefited from that continuity. The original investigators could not solve it with the tools available to them, but their work created the foundation for investigators decades later. The case also changed the conversation about what a cold case can be. For years, the phrase cold case often suggested something nearly impossible to solve. It implied a crime buried beneath time, a file gathering dust, and evidence too old to matter. April Tinsley's murder challenged that assumption. The evidence was old, but it was not useless. The DNA was old, but it was not irrelevant. The investigation was old, but it was not finished. The breakthrough demonstrated that age alone does not determine the value of evidence. Sometimes the oldest evidence can become the most important evidence in the room. That reality matters to other families still waiting for answers. Somewhere in law enforcement storage facilities are biological samples collected decades ago. Somewhere are unidentified DNA profiles attached to cases that never produced a suspect. Somewhere are families still wondering whether anyone remembers the person they lost. April's case showed them that an unanswered case can still change. It can move after years of silence. It can suddenly become active again. It can produce an arrest when almost everyone has stopped expecting one. The science does not guarantee that every case will be solved, but it can create possibilities that did not exist before, and that possibility is powerful. For April's family, the most important breakthrough was not the technology itself. It was the fact that April's name finally had an answer attached to it. Someone was responsible. Someone had been identified. Someone had admitted what he had done. The decades of uncertainty had ended. But the emotional consequences remained. April could never grow older. She could never see the world that changed after her death. She could never know that investigators would one day use her DNA to identify the man responsible. Her family had to continue living with the fact that justice arrived almost 30 years after the crime. That delay is impossible to undo, but it does not make the eventual identification meaningless. Quite the opposite, it demonstrates why investigators continue pursuing cases long after the headlines disappear, because somewhere inside an old evidence box may be the clue that has been waiting for the future. April's case was proof of that. A tiny genetic signature survived the years. It survived failed searches. It survived changing technology. It survived the fading of memory, and eventually it found the man who had spent nearly 3 decades believing he could remain unidentified. The silence did not end because someone finally remembered something. It ended because science connected the past to the present, and once that connection was made, the mystery could no longer remain hidden.